Yeah. Shall we continue with the same witness?
Your Excellency, I'm grateful for your indulgence, and I'm grateful to Mr. Cottle for his patience. Mr. Cottle, could we return briefly to the question of volume rebate rates? Yes. Could we look at E3, page 1381? The left-hand column in that table. And the second paragraph of your left-hand column, you say Mr. Cottle has relied upon the witness evidence of Mr. Saliba regarding the volume rebate rates.
Yes.
And could I just look briefly at the following paragraph? You say Mr. Cottle considers there's contemporaneous evidence which suggests there was an expectation that GHS would secure higher volume rebates percentages than OIC. Can I just ask very quickly, can you recall what that evidence was?
What I'm referring to there is the MOU forecast, which was appended to the forecast that was appended to the MOU. Now, whilst I don't rely on that in terms of the detailed calculations for the reasons I set out yesterday, what that document does, as far as I'm concerned, is it sets out the principle that the two parties seem to expect that there would be higher volume rebates generated such that GLOBEMED would actually receive an amount over and above once they got beyond the 15 million slab. So that's what my reference is there.
You get the detail, but you extract some of the broader trends.
Not so much the trends, the concept, really.
And you say, or you refer to an expectation. That's an expectation implicit in the document?
Well, I think it is from the point of view of what you've got is a forecast. And the forecast obviously starts off with the main OIC admin fees. It also then includes within the P&L account two lines, one a gross figure for the amount of volume rebates, and then a deduction for the amount that would be paid away to OIC under the terms of the MOU. And there's a net figure that is generated for GLOBEMED. So given that incorporated the slabs, the presumption there would be that volume rebates would be generated over and above the 15 slab.
We just consider briefly the front end, if you like, of the volume rebate rate. Now, I think the process of ramp up is essentially from mid-2015 to mid-2016. That's right.
Late 2016. We assume that the lives are transferred over a 19-month period.
Mid-15 to late 2016?
Yes.
Now, in terms of the volume rebate rate, you go from 0.56% in 2015 to 2% in 2016.
Yes.
Now, if the negotiation of the volume rebate rate happened in the year before, that would mean the 2016 rate had been negotiated in 2015.
Well, there would be some volume rebates being renegotiated throughout 2016, I've assumed.
Yeah, so you're assuming that some of the negotiation happens in the same year, i.e. in 2016?
It would happen. What I'm assuming is that the agreement, the lives start coming across in May. It then takes a period of time for GLOBEMED to be in a position to demonstrate to providers that it's managing the portfolio. I'm assuming that some of those negotiations would then lead to higher rates based on the evidence of Mr. Saliba.
But if the negotiations had happened in the previous year, there were a very small number of lives prior to the beginning of the transition process in mid-2015. Therefore, the volume rebate rate would have been very low if it had been negotiated in 2015.
But in terms of the negotiation you're going to have with a provider, they're going to be interested in the future. They're going to want to know what referrals they're going to get going forward. I don't believe that the negotiations are a retrospective. I think what you do is you enter into a negotiation based on an expectation that we'll be managing 300, 400, 500,000 lives. And that's why I would expect that when the negotiations take place, that's why you'd have a higher rebate. And also, to a certain extent, bear in mind, I'm also assuming, and I appreciate it as an assumption based on the evidence of Mr. Youssef, that they would start to generate some non-OIC business. So if you're having a negotiation with a healthcare provider, you're able to say, well, look, I've got OIC's portfolio. and I'm starting to take on board other insurers which will generate lives, and therefore can I have a higher rate?
When we come to the back end, the ramp down in 2019, told us yesterday that the negotiation would have been in the previous year, that's say in 2018.
Well, it would have been, but then they would have known that they were managing a significant number of lives throughout 2019, because they would have known when those lives would have been handed back. And they still would have had the non-OIC portfolio at that stage. And at that stage, the non-OIC portfolio was assumed to be growing, becoming more and more significant.
Might it not be suggested there's some inconsistency between, on the one hand, the front end, the ramp up, when you essentially assume that the negotiation is in the same year, i.e. 2016, your position on the back end, ramp down in 2019, where you're positing a negotiation the previous year in 2018?
I don't believe there is an inconsistency, because at the end of the day, if you're having a negotiation with someone at the beginning of the year, you're saying, let's do business together. I can bring you this number of lives going forward. If healthcare providers in 2018 had reacted to the reduction that was going to happen in the future by reducing their volume rebate percentages, there must be a risk that GLOBEMED would use other providers and they would lose that business.
That's a consequence of the anticipation that there will be a ramp down, isn't it, over 2019?
Well, they would have known there would have been a ramp down, because the terms would have required GLOBEMED to hand back the lives. But those lives aren't disappearing into the ether, they're effectively going back to OIC.
Rebate is being attained by GMGHS as the TPA company, isn't it?
It is.
By reference to its portfolio.
It's referenced its portfolio. So its portfolio would decrease, but there would be a significant number of lives still being managed throughout 2019, and there still would have been the ability to aggregate from non-OIC insurers.
You maintain the highest volume rebate rate of 3%, even for 2019.
I have kept that throughout 2019, yes.
And I think you mentioned too that the ramp down in 2019 was lumpy, and I think you meant by that many of the departures, or the transition, the movings out of GMGHS, latter part of 2019.
From my recollection, yes, there was still a significant number of lives in that last sort of half of the year, quarter of the year. I don't have the figures to hand, unfortunately.
We just look at E1356. If we look at the three shaded lines here, the third of the shaded lines below the line, essentially, the monthly net movement in total lives. So that's movement lives out of GMGHS, isn't it? Out of
sorry, I lost the page.
So we're looking at the third shaded line down. If we scroll across to 2019.
2019, yes.
Is your point that December has 114,000 lives moving out?
Well, it's the fact that if you look at that sort of last 4 or 5 months, you've got 60,000 in September, 40,000 in October, 49,000 in November, and 114,000 in December. So you've got a reasonably high number of lives as compared to, say, the beginning of the year. So January, you've only got 28,000.
But April, you've got 95,000.
It's lumpy, as I said. I didn't say it was smooth. I said it was lumpy.
Okay, but there's no particular distortion towards the end of the year. More people leaving at the end of the year than the first.
I would say there's probably, I haven't done the numbers exactly, but I think there's looks to be more in the second half of the year than in the first half of the year.
I'd suggest to you that there's no lumpiness in these figures that can be used to excuse an inconsistent approach.
I hear what you say, but I still think that I've taken a reasonable approach.
Very good. We've looked at your reliance on Mr. Saliba, and you mentioned that you rely on his evidence and experience. Were you aware that until 2013, he'd been the finance and administration manager of Sodexo in Lebanon?
I'm not sure if I was or not. I might have been aware of it.
That's a facilities management company, isn't it?
I believe so, yes.
You would have, insofar as you were presented with figures or tables by Mr. Saliba, there's no evidence that you push back or probe any of those assumptions, is there?
We had a dialogue at various times and tried to understand where the numbers were coming from or what the basis of his assumptions. But as I said, I don't have the industry expertise to push back and say, no, it's 2.75 rather than 2.5 or 3. You know, I worked on the assumption that, you know, he was providing his witness evidence in mid-22. By that stage, he'd been involved in the TPA for 8-9 years. I had no reason to doubt his experience or what he was saying on some of these things.
Prior to his producing his report, did you seek to identify the evidence you would need as to matters of TPA expertise?
Yes, we tried to do some research into the marketplace, and we were struggling, and that's why David Youssef came on board in terms of the non-IOIC part of the claim. But there didn't seem to be a huge amount of information within the public domain, and what we saw was often quite contradictory. And the other issue in some respects is that this is a very case-specific matter. We're talking about what GMGH would have done if it had been the recipient of the OIC lives. So looking at the information that's in the public domain, you wouldn't get that granular sort of detail around the key things like employment costs.
You're asked to produce a loss of profits report, and you explain that you're not a market expert or not a TPA expert.
Not a market expert, no.
And on that basis, there are certain inputs or data that you require in order to do your bit of the loss of profit assessment.
Like every quantum case you work on, or pretty much every case you work on, you don't tend to have a huge amount of specific knowledge before coming onto this assignment. What you bring in is the experience of these types of cases and the disciplines of trying to marshal information. So we were obviously heavily involved in assisting clients in terms of their requests for disclosure, which was quite a long drawn-out process. So, you know, we had a dialogue with clients and we said, look, we want this information from OIC, and then, you know, our work on this initially started off very much as a review of the MOU forecasts and model. We then reached the conclusion that we weren't comfortable in terms of relying on them. So then it was a question of what alternative information can we use to try and build our model. Because effectively we were building the model pretty much from scratch. And then that involved a dialogue with the client in terms of what information they could provide, what assumptions they were coming up with. And we considered those. And as I said to you yesterday, if the figures that Mr. Saliba had been coming up with had led to a situation where the costs were significantly lower than the information with the MOU, I would have been more concerned, because, you know, that could indicate that maybe they weren't proven enough. But the fact that they were coming up with numbers which by and large were higher gave me a degree of comfort when based on the experience of Mr. Saliba as well.
So insofar as you identified information and data that you required from Mr. Saliba and from the client, fair to say that Mr. Saliba was effectively backfilling the fact and opinion evidence that you couldn't provide?
Backfilling, is that the right term? I was asking questions of him, and based on his experience, he would then give me information or set things out in assumptions in his witness statement, yes.
The information he had provided was then formalised as a witness statement?
Yes.
Relies substantially too on Mr. Youssef's evidence, don't you?
I do, yes.
And that's because you couldn't possibly model the revenues that GMGHS could have achieved from non-OIC insurers.
Yes, there was a difficulty because effectively you're talking about a counterfactual scenario, so there wouldn't be any information out in the marketplace in terms of what GMGH would have done. So it required somebody to reach a conclusion as to what they thought GMGH could do if they had the benefit of the OIC lives and if they were seeking to secure other business. So it needed somebody who knew something about the market, which I don't have that information. So I was reliant on yes.
And he was providing evidence as to the percentage of the market that he believed could have been secured by GMGHS.
Yes, he was, you know, firstly he was addressing the market size, and then he did a sort of brief analysis of the components of the market in terms of TPAs and the tiers, and then he reached conclusions in terms of how he thought GMGH could have done if it had been able to leverage off the OIC portfolio.
In effect, Mr. Youssef is the sole basis for your modelling of the non-OIC revenues between 2016.
Pretty much so, yeah.
And were you aware that Mr. Youssef was operating in the absence of any publicly available data on the Dubai TPA market?
I know that he was struggling to get hold of data, yes.
He was relying, wasn't he, very substantially on his professional experience?
I know that his experience was certainly a significant component of his report.
Essentially, he identifies the ranking that GMGHS would have had in the TPA market. So he puts it at number 3.
Yes. Yeah.
And then he has put it into tier 2, as he defines it, as one of 7. And then he assesses the proportion of the market serviced by tier 2 providers.
Yes, I think he comes up with an assessment of how much that total tier would have. I know that he was struggling to try and work out who within the tiers had which share of that tier. And then ultimately we were in a situation where we took an approach that said, look, with GMGH coming into that market, it would take 6 into 7. We then divided the size of that tier by 7, and then made certain assumptions about how long it would take.
If we look at Appendix 9 in your report, which is at E1, page 632. So picking up at paragraph 3, the key figures Mr. Youssef provides in respect to Dubai insurance market are as follows. Public available data provide population figures. That is essentially the only known in his report, or the only known in his report.
I wouldn't necessarily like to say that. It's certainly a figure that he got from the public domain.
He uses a combination of his own judgment and benchmarking against Abu Dhabi to arrive at the estimated proportion of the Dubai population that were covered by health insurance during that time. So he uses his judgment, and to jump forward, he assesses a number of 90%, doesn't he?
Gets to a situation 90% based on the fact that, from my understanding, Abu Dhabi was a few years ahead of Dubai in terms of mandatory insurance, and therefore it had, in some respects, gone through the sort of learning curve, if that's the right word, in terms of insuring people. And I think he took the view that Dubai would follow a similar pattern, albeit slightly later.
That's the 90%. And then little b, Mr. Youssef provides an estimate of the proportion of the Dubai insured market that he considers would have been serviced by TPAs, and that was, his estimate was 50%, wasn't it?
I thought it was 60, but I'm happy to be if it's 50.
I'll show you in a moment.
Okay.
And then little c, if I could just go to the third sentence. Mr. Youssef uses his knowledge of the market to arrive at assumptions regarding the proportion of the market that GMGHS and the other tier 2 providers would have collectively serviced. So all of those are essentially estimates based on judgment, experience and knowledge, aren't they?
Yes, I think that's a fair conclusion.
And then if I could take you very quickly to page 634. The table.
Sorry, I can see here it starts at 50, but then moves up, I think, in terms of when we were talking about proportion service.
Yes. I'm just going to look at 2016, really, just by way of example. So we start with the Dubai population, which is the one figure that is anchored in public information. And then he estimates a proportion, which is 90%, and we've seen him how he does that on the previous page, haven't we? That's a matter of judgment. And then that gives him an estimated insured population, doesn't it, based on his judgment figure of 90%?
Yes, it does, yeah.
And then there's a further judgment figure, a proportion of the market using TPAs, which is 50%.
Yes.
And then he applies that to produce a further estimate, doesn't he? And then he applies another judgment number, his 35% of the Tier 2 market percentage.
Yeah, I think that one, from my recollection, wasn't just based purely on judgment. I think, from my recollection, I think he knew that the two largest TPAs, and I can't recall their names, but they had a very significant share, and I think that left essentially 35% for the other, what he calls Tier 2.
And that then gives him an estimated live service by Tier 2, and then the following item row, an estimated number of Tier 2 TPAs, including GMGHS. So essentially, Mr. Youssef, his analysis, and I think we're looking here at enhanced non-OIC lives, requires layers of estimation based on broad market experience, what he referred to as professional experience.
It certainly required judgment based on, in some cases, little bits of information was in the public domain, but his experience. But the reason for that was that the information simply wasn't there in the public domain that would enable you to do it any other way, I would say.
And you say in your report that Mr. Youssef, your words, adopts what he considers to be a reasonable methodology. And that smacks to me a little bit of distancing. Is that fair?
No, I don't think it is. I think at the end of the day, we did have some discussions with Mr. Youssef as he was preparing his report. They were ultimately his judgments in terms of how he arrived at, but I was aware how the methodology he'd used. I didn't just receive his report and everything was handed to me. So we had some discussions. This is the methodology he came up with. I'm assuming that he wouldn't put anything in there we didn't think was reasonable. I'm not in any way trying to distance myself from him, but ultimately I do rely on his judgment.
You say he considered it to be reasonable. Did you consider it to be reasonable?
I don't think I'm in a position to express a view on it. At the end of the day, I don't have the market knowledge or the experience to say 50% or 90%. I'm not in that market, and therefore I think it would be wrong for me to say judgment is reasonable. I've communicated what he says. The way he described it to me, it didn't seem unreasonable in terms of the methodology. But I couldn't say here and say he's absolutely right, because I simply don't have that knowledge.
The conclusion of Mr. Youssef's analysis is that GMGHS would have had 130,000 non-OIC lives, merely by reason of having OIC as strategic partner.
That is the upshot of his analysis, yes, that over a period of time, starts off relatively small in 2016, it then gathers some momentum and gets up to slightly more than 130,000 actually.
There was a suggestion yesterday, and I think you've used the term today, of starting from scratch, that you felt the MOU was sufficiently spurious in its detail that you needed to start again in the modelling exercise.
Well, effectively, I and my team have built our own model. We have certain known figures, so we have the OIC lives. We then have assumptions based on the evidence of Mr. Saliba in terms of the key inputs like head count, and then various other things where I've relied on him. So yes, it's a new model.
I'm still struggling to understand why you needed to rebuild the model when you already had the model in the MOU. Now, if I can just break this down, I understand that there were arithmetical errors that you felt you needed to correct.
Correcting the arithmetic issues in some respects was a relatively minor point. You know, you can, if an item hasn't been translated, you could put the translation rate in. If a formula seemed to have a wrong component to it, you could in theory change that. My main concern was I didn't have anybody within GLOBEMED who could speak to that model with any degree of authority. But more importantly, I took the view that by May 2015, the position had moved on somewhat, such that we were dealing with a different time period, a different number of lives, and at the same time I had the benefit of being able to speak to someone within GLOBEMED who to me struck me as having the right experience and knowledge, who was coming up with alternative figures in terms of the key inputs. So it's a combination of those that led me to build my own model effectively.
Why did you need alternative figures for the key inputs? I understand that the number of lives may have been out and that you may have needed to adjust or flex for that. But why do you need alternative figures for the other inputs?
Well, the number of lives drives pretty much everything. It drives headcount, and by May 2015, we already had moved on from the point of view that GLOBEMED had already, during the startup phase, recruited a significant number of people ready to start the TPA. We had actual salaries at that point in time, rather than having to rely on something that was 6 months old and was entirely forecast based. And I think there's a risk in sort of cherry picking little bits, as picking some bits from the MOU and some bits from elsewhere, because the risk there is that you aren't consistent from the point of view of Mr. Saliba. In terms of some of the things that Mr. Saliba provided to us, in terms of the assumptions that went into his witness statement, it's not a like-for-like comparison. So you can't see the exact cost categories in Mr. Saliba's witness statement you can see in the MOU. Now, the risk for me there was, if I took some of Mr. Saliba's evidence, but took some figures from the MOU, I could either have gaps or I could have overlap. And therefore, in some respects, I think it was purer to accept one set of numbers which were, as I've set out in my report, based on various things, rather than cherry pick and say, right, okay, I'll take the MOU for general costs, but I'll take some other figure elsewhere.
The MOU model can be flexed both for lives and for headcount, can't it? Relatively easily.
It can be amended, yes.
You mentioned general expenses. The spreadsheet behind the MOU provides an extraordinary degree of detail, doesn't it? For example, in the breakdown of legal fees dealing with regulatory issues, legal fees dealing with hard, legal fees dealing with HA. It's a huge amount of detail.
It's a massive amount of detail. It's almost too detailed, you know. From my recollection, the assumptions around headcount went into levels of detail about how much time people would need to have off for sickness and things like that. Now, I could see the way it was built up, but I didn't have the opportunity to actually speak to anyone and say, right, okay, why have you made this assumption? Why have you put this in for this particular cost category? Why have you flexed it this particular way? I simply didn't have the benefit of that. And so I felt it was more appropriate to build something from scratch, maybe in less detail, but ultimately, the numbers I come out with, in many instances, come up with higher numbers than the MOU. So in some respects, I'm reducing the claim by using Mr. Saliba's numbers rather than the MOU. And again, if I look at the Mr. Burrows, in some instances, initially started off by using figures other than the MOU, then in some instances went back and started to use the MOU. But when I look at on a like-for-like basis between Mr. Burrows and myself, with one or two exceptions which are set out, which are amortization, which we addressed yesterday, royalties, which depends on a legal stroke factual issue. If I look at the totality of our expenses across the three main categories, which are payroll, other personnel costs, and general costs, they are remarkably similar in terms of the overall total.
Going back to marketing expenses, the MOU breaks down an analysis of every type of marketing activity, the purpose of each marketing activity, whether it be entertainment, seminars, advertising, corporate hospitality.
It goes into incredible detail. I'm not in any way disputing that.
The target audience of the relevant marketing, the proposed spending on each type of marketing in each year, how in that world do you need to check or interrogate or understand that data? What is it you need to ask about?
Well, is it a reasonable assumption? Is an amount that is put in there for, entertaining regulators, is that reasonable? Is it allowable? I don't know.
Your approach, if you look at very quickly at D352, having rejected that detail, is to use this table in respect of all of the general operating expenses that has been produced by the GHS finance team.
It is an assessment based on the figures which were appended to Mr. Sleever's witness statement, yes.
No detail, no interrogation, and no probing, is there?
There is some detail behind that within Mr. Sleever's witness statement. It breaks it down into a number of categories. But I've just summarised the figures there. I haven't gone through.
And you've rightly accepted in some numbers, for example, cost items, you come out higher than Mr. Burrows. But the overall effect of your approach, dismantling the model and starting again, compared to Mr. Burrows' approach, essentially adjusting and flexing the model, produces very different figures, isn't it?
No, the different figures don't arise from the assumptions we make around headcount, personnel costs, general costs, and things. The primary differences are driven by three things: duration of the contract, inclusion of Bupa, and the issue around using alternative TPAs. They account for the vast majority of the difference, with the exception that we differ on amortisation, which I've already agreed on. And there's a slight difference. I think I've got a slightly higher rent figure than Mr. Burrows. But the difference is overall in terms of the claim. My figures of 95 million or so for OIC and his figures of, I think it's about 5 million, I think. They aren't driven by differences on cost assumptions or whether he's relied on the MOU or I've built my model. They simply aren't. They are the key drivers of those three factual issues that I've explained.
Just finally, to explore the stability, if you like, of the model, your second statement, I think, in terms of the OIC losses, produced a figure of 85 million dirham. That's right.
I think so. I'm not 100% sure, but yeah, I'll take your word for it now. I'm sure someone will point out if it's wrong.
And your analysis in the joint report suggested that the figure for the OIC losses was in fact 95.
Can you show the numbers?
Certainly, yes. E3, the first one of those, 1314.
Yes.
Then the joint statement, which I'm sure is at E3 1396.
Yes.
I think, to be fair to you, there's a slight difference in interest calculation, but that doesn't explain the difference between 85 million and 95 million, does it?
So in terms of how the numbers have progressed, we produced our first report. We then received Mr. Burrows' report that gave us additional disclosure. That led us to amend the rate of ramp up because we had now specific information around policy inception dates. The number of lives then drove some changes in terms of headcount, and so that meant that was the change between my first report and my second report. So between my first and second report, the only changes arise as a consequence of the disclosure provided by Mr. Burrows.
Didn't put your first report figure to you.
All right. Okay. And then moving on from my supplemental report to the joint statement, there are a number of changes. So the biggest change in terms of quantum is, as part of the joint statement process with Mr. Burrows, we considered the issue of actual costs in the period from May to December 2015. Mr. Burrows had taken what appeared to be a reasonable approach of assuming that there were certain actual costs related to the TPA post-May that they hadn't been able to avoid. So within his calculations, I think he'd made a deduction from the cost savings figure, which would have had the effect of increasing the claim. And I think his figure was about 5 point something million. I listened to what he said, it appeared to be reasonable, and I adopted a figure of about 4 million. So that accounts for about 4 million difference between the two. The other significant change I can think of is rental costs, where on further consideration and as part of the joint statement process, it became apparent to me that I had deducted too much by way of rental savings in my first report, in that I had deducted the entire cost of the new premises, whereas actually what I should have deducted was the incremental cost, so the difference between the existing premises costs and the new premises costs. So that reduced my cost saving on rental. And then, as you say, there was a change in the interest. I can't remember what the impact overall was, but both Mr. Burrows and I revisited our interest calculations because there was a mechanical arithmetic issue that we both agreed on. And I think there was also an issue in terms of the rate. So I think those are the three changes that I can recall. I can't recall there being much else.
And the reduction of the rent saving had the effect of pushing up the profit figure, didn't it?
It had the effect of pushing up the profit figure because I wasn't making such a big deduction for cost savings, because I was, in my joint statement figures, I was only reflecting the fact that there was to be a higher rental cost in the new premises as opposed to the entire cost in the new.
We could look very quickly at the non-OIC losses. So your first report figure you came up with 35 million dirham. Do you need to look at these all?
No,
okay.
Yeah.
And then your second supplementary report, you arrived at a figure of 34 million dirham. And then the joint report, the figure drops to 32 million.
And the reason for that was there are a number of cost categories where I take an approach of allocating the entire cost between the non-OIC and the OIC part of the claim. So if the core costs in effect of the claim change, the allocation changes. So by way of example, my rent figure would have come down for the reason I've explained. Therefore, the amount that I would allocate to the non-OIC part of the claim would also differ.
That's an extraordinary degree of instability and uncertainty in a loss of profit model, isn't it?
I don't believe it is. I don't believe it is at all. The purpose of a joint statement process is to consider issues, hear what we each have to say. As I've said, the biggest change was this issue around actual costs in the period from June to December. Mr. Burrows, in his report, had taken what appeared to be a reasonable approach in terms of acknowledging that there were probably some costs that had continued. I felt it was reasonable to do that. I didn't quite agree with him in entirety. I made a slightly lower change, 4 rather than 5 million, but I don't see that as being massively unstable.
Wait there, Mr. Cottle. My friend will have some questions.
Thank you very much. I do have some questions, but I wasn't meant to stop there. So with me, Your Excellency, I do have a couple of extra questions, but I've put them somewhere. They were from yesterday. Yes, there we go. Apologies for the slight delay. I've got two questions, Mr. Cottle. One was that you were asked yesterday about the administration fee revenue that could have been achieved from this contract. So we're dealing with the OIC side of the equation. And you were asked, obviously, you gave some evidence that the amount of administration fee revenue that would have been received would depend on whether the contract was decided to be 3 years in length or 4 years in length.
Yes.
And you were asked what the difference would be to your calculation of administration fees if, rather than 4 years, as you've used, it was calculated as 3 years. Can I take you, please, to page 1396? And do you see there, that is your revised assessment of the claim, and you set out a summary of the financial detail?
Yes.
And you'll see the administration fee income is in the top line. And you will, I think you said you would disregard the 4th year. So looking at that schedule, what would you say was the difference to your model of taking a 3-year approach as opposed to a 4-year approach?
Well, you'd lose 59 million of administrative fee income for a start.
But we're just dealing with the administration fee income for now. So that's the effect. I'm just asking you about the effect on the administration
fee. So 59 divided by 180, 32%.
Yeah, but in terms of the actual number that you reduce it by.
Take out 59 million of revenue.
And then you were also asked about the impact of eliminating the Bupa portfolio from this.
Yes.
And I think it was put to you that the difference between including and excluding the Bupa portfolio would be about 27 million dirhams. Would that be based on taking a 3-year or a 4-year calculation?
I can't recall the figure of 27 million.
I think it was put to you and you said that sounded a bit right. You weren't sure.
I think it was put to me there was 30, and I think I did a back of a fag packet exercise and said 27.
27.
Yes.
I see. Thank you. Was that based on your assessment of the fee income over the full 4 years or the 3 years?
The way I did that calculation, as I said, on the sort of back of a fag packet, so to speak, was I think I took the 180 million, which I knew was the admin fees, and I think I took around 15%. Yes, I was 27. So that was based on the totality of a 4-year.
So that's based on a 4-year. Would it be the same or different, the reduction, if you came down to a 3-year?
Yes, it would.
It would be?
It would be a lower value.
I see. All right, and if I take you to page 1135, this is Mr. Burrows' own report, and at paragraph 5.04.12, Burrows calculates the administrative fees over 3 years, and he says that those fees, including Bupa, would be, do you see there, 120.8 million, which reduces to 102.3 million. So I make that a difference of, give or take, about 18 million. Perhaps it's
about 18.5 million.
18.5 million. Would you agree or disagree that if we're working on a 3-year contract, that would be... No, I'm asking him to comment on that. You asked him the question. Or disagree? I said, would you agree or disagree with that? Or do you have any comment on that?
I've no reason to doubt those figures.
What are you talking about? I'm sorry, my questioning is being interrupted for no reason whatsoever. What do you say about that difference then?
I've no reason to disagree with that figure. I think we probably would have looked at it at some stage and concluded it was reasonable in terms of the calculations we worked out.
Thank you very much. Do you have any questions?
I don't have.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
That's the expert witness for evidence for the claimant.
I believe the next witness is available.
Mr. Burrows, who is the accountancy expert on behalf of the defendant.
Can I start with him now and break at 11:30 if you like?
I'm in your Excellency's hands.
Much better.
My lord, the defendant calls Mr. Clive Burrows. Thank you.
Thank you.
Clive Burrows, forensic accountant. I swear by the Almighty God to say the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth.
Barrows, could you look at bundle E, page 1101?
Yes.
Is this your expert report?
It is.
Turn on to page E 1201.
Yes.
Is that your signature? Had the opportunity recently to reread your expert report.
I have.
Confirm that it still represents your true and complete opinion.
Yeah.
Can you turn, please, to the joint statement? You and Mr. Cottle.
Yes.
Turn to page E1372.
Yes.
In this statement, you see a statement of the matters on which you agree and disagree.
Correct.
So far as it states your opinion, and indeed your opinion is in the right-hand column, isn't it, of the summary of issues not agreed?
It is, yes.
And if we turn on to page 1395, your signature.
It is.
Have you had the opportunity recently to reread this joint statement?
I have.
And you confirm that it is true and complete insofar as it states your opinion?
I can confirm such.
Good morning, Mr. Barrows. I think you've been sitting through the trial, so I think you know how this goes. I'll be asking
Portions
you...
of the trial, yes.
Right, okay, but you've seen it, so you know. I'm Mr. Montague-Smith, I'm representing the claimant, and I'm going to be asking you a few questions. I want to just start with the shape of your calculation. Can you turn, please, to page 1399? And I believe this is an exhibit to the joint statement where you set out your updated calculation of the losses that you have calculated the claimant suffered as a result of the cancellation, termination, whatever you will, of the contract. Is that right?
Yes, it is my loss of profit calculation.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask you some questions about the top line of this, which is the total gross revenue that would have been received, and you've calculated it over a 4-year period, but assuming a 3-year contract.
I've calculated it over a 4-year period, starting from the transfer of lives in May 2015, and then after a 3-year period, which is I think ending at the end of 2017, taking into account a ramp down in year 4.
Yes, quite. And so, I mean, we've heard some talk about this, but your assumption is based on the contract itself running for 3 years.
It is. My assumption is underpinned by the assertion that the contract year is for a 3-year period, inclusive of the 1-year notice period.
Yes,
which I understand is a legal point of discussion.
Correct. So I won't be asking you any questions about which you think is the right answer, because you very fairly accept that that's not an issue for the expert witness.
It's not an issue that I see that's part of my accounting evidence.
All right. But the way you get to this number, total gross revenue, is effectively by taking the things that we know about OIC's portfolio in the time and applying that to the fee structure in the TPA agreement. Is that right?
Sorry, do you mind repeating the question?
Yes. So I'm just asking. I'm just trying to establish the broad structure. There's no tricks or here. I think it's clear, and we can show you if you like. The way you calculate that overall fee revenue is by taking what we know about the lives under management, the portfolio under management by OIC during these relevant years, and applying that information to the fee structure in the TPA services agreement.
It is underpinned by assumptions. So one of the key assumptions in terms of the lives is that 100% of the OIC portfolio would be transferred. That's an assumption that underpins my scope. I understand that there's some debate as to whether 100% of the portfolio could have been transferred, or if some of it may have lost in transition to the other service providers. So that is a key assumption. So I don't think I can go as far to say that is known in the sense that 100% of the portfolio would be transferred. I have taken the assumption that a portion of the portfolio would be carved out. That's the 50,000 lives that's been referred to as part of the exclusivity agreement between the parties, whereby 50,000 lives could have remained with OIC. And there's also an element where BUPA is assumed under my calculation to have not been transferred.
Yes. So you haven't assumed 100% transfer. You've assumed a transfer of the portfolio, less the 50,000 lives, less BUPA. Is that fair?
Yes, that is fair.
And then to get to the data about, and then you've taken that number for each period, and you have applied that number, or those numbers, to the fee structure in the TPA services agreement, haven't you?
I have.
And that generates the administration fees, doesn't it?
Yes, it generates the administration fees on an earned and unearned basis.
Yes, but I know you're slightly anticipating my questions, and we will talk about interest later on. But at the moment, I'm asking you some very short questions, just so we can frame the questioning that's actually going to come, so that the judge has a clear understanding of where what we're talking about. But you're
in summary, that top line figure of gross revenue is based on the OIC portfolio that's been apportioned across, multiplied by the administration fee structure that's set out in the TPA.
Thank you. And just so the judge understands, there's no provision in here for volume rebates at all, because on your analysis, and we'll come to it, no volume rebates would have been earned.
That's right. Based on the OIC lives that have been transferred across, excluding BUPA and excluding the 50,000 lives, the volume rebate doesn't exceed the first slab, which would be effectively ceded to GMGHS.
As I said, we will talk about that in due course. I'm just trying to very quickly explain for the judge and help you do so the structure of the calculation. We will come on to volume rebates, and you'll have your chance to explain your position in relation to that. But so the source of the data from which you exclude 50,000 lives, from which you exclude BUPA, that is data that you have received from OIC.
Yes, it is.
And you've therefore, and you've based your calculations on that data, as we've seen. And as you understand it, Mr. Cottle now bases his data on, his calculations on the same data, doesn't he?
The same data sets, but with different assumptions, yes.
The different assumptions being the 3 or 4 years, the 50,000 lives, and BUPA.
Yeah, right.
And we'll talk about that, thank you. But save for those, it's the same data. Sorry,
Yes.
Thank you. And so is it fair, therefore, to assume that you accept that using the data is a better way of calculating the lost profit than using, for example, the projections that you will see in the MOU?
Yes, I would, in the sense that we have actual data pertaining to OIC, which we know retrospectively. So looking back, those lives are factual, and as a result, I think it's a better basis for calculating the gross revenue.
And the data tells you, amongst not just the numbers, but it tells you the dates of policy inceptions, doesn't it?
It does.
And that therefore allows you to do an analysis of when those lives would have been transferred across from OIC to GLOBEMED, doesn't it?
Yeah, there are provisions under the TPA which states that the transfer process would effectively be driven by the new policies and the renewal of old policies. So that policy data set that I received following receipt of Mr. Cottle's report, I think gave a more accurate transfer process in terms of quantifying my timing of loss of profit.
Thank you. And in fact, rather than assuming a 1-year transfer, you also, common with Mr. Cottle, assumed an 18-month transfer. Is that right?
Not entirely right. Just by virtue of the fact that you only have a policy for a year, after 12 months, effectively so when you start the transfer process, and it's a little bit complicated to try and work out, possible but complicated to work out the timing of new policy inceptions in the first 12 months. Once you've started that transfer process within the first 12 months, the 13th month is in effect either a new policy or a renewed policy. So in terms of the OIC portfolio, I think it's fair to say that all of the transfer of lives have effectively happened by 12 or 13 months. The BUPA portfolio is slightly different because there is, as I understand, factual evidence delaying the transfer of the BUPA portfolio to a later period in 2015. But I think it's important to note that in terms of the administration fee income, that effectively crystallizes on an annual basis. So although not all of the lives have moved over by the end of 2015, they have by the end of 2016, but the lives have transferred over slightly earlier than that. So I think it was a bit of an oversimplification to say that they're transferred in an 18-month period. I think they're transferred earlier, but the end of year administration fee income figure at the end of 2016 encapsulates the full transfer.
So it doesn't much matter, is that what you're saying, whether it's transferred, just before the end of 2016, whether the full transfer occurs, or whether it happens right at the end of the year, or whether it happens in the middle of the year, because the fees are the same. Is that what you're saying? Just to the administration fee income?
To the administration fee, I think there's a timing issue that I'm sure that we'll get onto later in relation to entitlement versus accruals.
Yes, to the recognition of the income. I'm going to leave that till later, so don't worry about that. We will come back to it. So I'm not going to miss you. You won't miss your opportunity to explain your position. All right. Fine. Now, when it comes to the revenue, as we've seen under the contract, there was the administration fees, but there was also the potential for earning volume rebates. But you've told us that you don't think they would have earned any volume rebates. So we'll just focus, I think, on administration fees for now. If we turn to page 1399. And we're back to, so we should be on the same page that we were on earlier. And we see your total for the 3 years is 26,864,726. Now, unfortunately, you're both using different currencies, so we're going to have to do a conversion. Would you accept that that is 98.7 million dirhams? I see you've got a calculator there. Oh, you don't have a calculator there. Just so that we can compare numbers, it might be helpful. You don't know what the number is in dirhams? Is it all right if I hand you a calculator?
Yes, thank you.
For completeness?
Using 3.67.
98 million dirhams.
98 million dirhams. Okay. And so that is what you say the claimant would have earned in administration fees if OIC had transferred across to GlobeMed all of its portfolio except for 50,000 lives and Bupa.
Yes,
Over a 3-year contract.
over a 3-year contract.
And we see Mr. Cottle's estimate, calculation, which is at page 1396. See there, he's got 2 lines at the top there, one for administration fee income and one for volume rebates, but focusing in on administration fee income, he comes out at 180 million dirhams. You see that?
Yes.
So between you, there is about, what, 82 million dirhams difference on the fee income, just looking at those basic numbers.
90 less 180 million.
180 million less than 98.
98. Yes.
Yes, that one, hopefully we can do quite quickly, can't we? So that's 82? All right. And I think you accept that 82 million difference, or whatever it is precisely, comes down to those 3 issues that you mentioned. The length of the contract, whether you include Bupa lives, whether you include the 50,000. I'm going to need a verbal answer, sorry.
Yes.
So once those issues are resolved, one way or another, then you both would reach an agreed position, effectively, in relation to the total fee income.
That's correct. Once those issues have been resolved.
And as you said,
or closed, agreed between the two calculations. As you mentioned, we'll recognise that the income, there's an issue about when you take that income into account, and we'll come back to that. But if, for example, it's a 4-year contract, you include Bupa, you don't exclude the 50,000 lives, then presumably you would agree with Mr. Cottle's figure of 180.3 million. We do say in our joint statements that the administration fee income is broadly agreed, subject to those legal and factual issues in relation to the contract period, Bupa, and 50,000 lives as part of the exclusivity.
And if we look at Mr. Cottle's calculation, would you accept that in relation to administration fee income, just trying to isolate those 3 issues, if one takes the 3 versus 4 year issue, the impact of that is likely to be the 4th year of the contract, and so is likely to be about 59.5, 60 million dirhams. Would you accept that?
Yeah, around that. So it's consistent with around a third.
Yeah,
that broadly makes sense. Yeah.
So if, for example, it was a 3-year contract, but you have to include the Bupa lives and you have to include OIC, then you would come to about 120 million dirhams, would you?
Around, I would like to be able to do specific calculations to take that deduction, but I think that's a broad approximation of the impact.
And you have calculated, haven't you, the impact of the Bupa issue on your assessment?
I have.
And if we look at that, it's at page 1135. And it's paragraph 5.04.12. So you say, and this is the 4th line, I calculate total administration fees for the 3 contractual years be 120,863,388, which reduces to 102,293,940. if I exclude the Bupa portfolio. So if you include the Bupa portfolio and you take a 3-year contract length, even excluding the 50,000 lives, you get to 120,863. Sorry, 120 million.
120 million.
863,000.
Million.
Yes?
Yes.
So the question I asked you earlier, you don't actually need to do the calculation. You've done it, haven't you?
Yes, I have done it as part of my first report. I'm just trying to think if there would be any differences between the impacts of my first report and the joint statement calculation. I can't think of any reasons as to why it would be materially different at this point.
Thank you. All right, but then the effect, and I'm using slightly rough numbers, and I know that you will, as an accountant, will no doubt tell me off for that, but I make it about, when you're working on a 3-year contract basis, the difference between including and excluding Bupa, you're going to give me a precise figure, looks about 18 million. Is that right? Maybe 18 and a half. Looking at your numbers here.
So you're taking the 102 and then, can you just walk me through how you got to that figure, please?
Yes, so I'm taking your 120 million, which is 3 years with Bupa, and then I'm taking away your 102 million, which is 3 years without Bupa. So the impact of Bupa, if on a 3-year assumption, is 18 million.
Yes.
All right. And we know we can add this all up, can't we? Because if you take your 120 million and you add up your 60 million, which we talked about, which is the final year just for the 4 years, you get to Mr. Cottle's 180 million. So we get some comfort that that's actually the sensitivity of the administration fees to these particular issues. Yes?
Yes.
Now, it's a bit more difficult, isn't it, to work out if it's a 4-year contract, what's the difference of including or excluding Bupa? I think on what he described as the back of a cigarette packet calculation, Mr. Cottle estimated it at about 27 million dirhams. Would you agree with that? So assuming 4 years, but exclude Bupa, how much does 180 million come down by? Mr. Cottle said about 27 million.
From his calculation?
From his calculation of 180 million. Well, it's both of your calculations of a 4-year contract with Bupa. And what I'm saying is, where do you get to if you then take 4-year contracts and exclude Bupa?
Yes, I'd say that's broadly consistent with my understanding.
All right, so now we've got 4 sums. We've got, because we've got 2 different variables that we've been talking about, with and without Bupa, and 3 or 4 years. So that produces 4 potential numbers for administration fees, doesn't it?
4 permutations, yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yes, 2 times 2. We can do that. So just running through them then, so it's clear. 4 years with Bupa, we're talking about 180 million. 3 years with Bupa, we're talking about 120 million. 4 years without Bupa, we're talking about 150, I think, 154 million. 3 years without Bupa, we're talking about, I make it 99 million. Sorry. Yeah, oh, you've got 102 million here, but it could be something like that. Would you accept that those are roughly what we're talking about as the 4 possible outcomes for fee administration income?
For fee administration income, I think that
Just that.
there are impacts further down the profit and loss accounts that would impact the net figure at the bottom. But if we're just solely focusing on the top line, yes, I think that those permutations sound about right. I would like to double check them, but
you haven't done that calculation yourself, even in the course of, I mean, you must have done some calculations to be able to get to the joint statement that once those 3 issues were resolved, you'd come out at the same numbers. So you've done some calculations.
I've done some testing, and I think also what's formed part of that conclusion is that we're underpinning our calculations by the same data set and the same structure. So yes, Mr. Cottle and I think are aligned. Whether those exact permutations, because as you will be aware, having to try and do it, there are, as well as BUPA, non-BUPA, 4 years, 3 years, there's the 50,000 lives in and out. So you effectively have 6 permutations. And I don't have the exact number of each permutation in my head at this point in time.
But you have done the calculations.
I have during the course of my reconciliation process and preparation process.
And have you prepared a model which is responsive to those permutations?
I have prepared a model, yes. I submitted a model as part of my first report, and that was really, in the essence, to try and assist the court on some of the legal and factual issues and the ramifications on my loss of profit if, for example, the court would find that 4 years is representative rather than 3, or that BUPA should be excluded or not, and on the 50,000 lives. As part of my joint statement exercise, I was not able to submit an updated model. I think that was contested as part of being served as the joint statement process. So the updated model based on my new numbers is not in evidence.
So the answer is that you could take the judge's conclusions on these 3 key points, put it into a model, and very quickly you can get out a number. Is that right?
Yes. That my model's designed to be able to do that, subject to, obviously underlying this is that 100% of the OIC portfolio would be transferred across, and there wouldn't be kind of attritional losses in the process of transfer. So I know that it's been part of evidence that some healthcare service providers were uncertain about the movement from OIC to the TPA. So that is an assumption that I do state at the very front end of my calculation.
You don't take a factual position on that, do you, though? You don't take a factual position. You don't take a position on whether or not, in fact, these things would have happened and service providers would have objected to GLOBEMED. You leave that to the witnesses and the lawyers, don't you?
I do. I leave that to the experts, but I do state it as a key assumption that for my model to work and for it to be to flex appropriately, it is underpinned by the fact that all of the portfolio is transferred.
I understand that model is in fact in evidence, albeit because we have PDF bundles, we don't have the functionality of your model in the bundles that we have for the court, but we do have available the actual model.
The old model is in evidence, not the model that specifies my joint statement calculation.
Well, we'll clarify that. Thank you. All right. So we've been dealing with the sort of first part of the potential revenue that could be received under the TPA services agreement. The other significant potential revenue was the volume rebates. Just to explain that, the volume rebates are a sum that is credited back by healthcare providers, depending on how much has been spent with that provider in relation to a particular portfolio. That's right, isn't it?
Yes, broadly my understanding.
And then it was going to be shared between the parties in various slabs or tranches, with the first slab going to the insurer, second slab going to the TPA, GLOBEMED, and then the third slab being shared on a proportional basis.
Yes, so the first slab amounts to up to 15 million dirhams, which goes to OIC, and then the second slab is the next increment of 5 million dirhams, and then anything over and above that is shared on the 70-30% split between OIC and GMGHS.
Yes, thank you. And if we look at page 1396, please. The difference between you and Mr. Cottle on this, it's in the second line. Mr. Cottle's total over the whole of the contract, he has it starting in 2018, but in relation, I think, to 2017 policies, the total is 17,169,000 and a bit, and you say nothing. You say that they would have got nothing.
Yes,
that's the difference.
The difference is that my calculation doesn't exceed that first slab of 15 million, and therefore there are no volume rebates to be payable in effect to GMGHS. So I have a zero here.
Yeah. All right. And this all depends, doesn't it, on what rebate percentage would have been achieved by GlobeMed if it had been administering this portfolio?
That's one of the aspects. I think the other aspect is the number of lives and claims paid, which forms part of that calculation.
I see. Yes, thank you. You're absolutely right. So that's right, because the larger the number of lives, the larger the number of claims, the more money spent, and therefore the larger sum against which the rebate percentage will be applied.
Correct.
And so if the lives go up, your calculations, then the rebate goes up.
So I've actually got actual claims paid data, which I utilize as part of my calculation. So there is a consistency in that we have the OIC portfolio, which specifies the number of lives, and my model then transfers that across over a period of time. But we also have the claims paid value, and that's the essence of the volume rebate, multiplied by the volume rebate percentage on claims paid. And again, so in terms of consistency, I'm using actual OIC portfolio lives, the actual claims paid against those lives, and the actual rebates earned on those claims paid.
Yes, and so you're taking OIC's actual results, albeit I think you exclude from your calculations the Bupa portfolio.
I do. So as part of the claims paid data, and this is something that I was able to extract from OIC, in order for me to be consistent in the application of the volume rebate, I need to make sure that I can discern which claims paid are for Bupa and which claims paid are for non-Bupa. When I'm excluding Bupa from my calculation of lives, I therefore need to be consistent in excluding claims paid, and therefore applying the right volume rebate percentage on the non-Bupa percentage or portion.
Thank you very much. And I mean, it's no criticism. I'm just trying to, at the moment, the way this questioning structures, I'm just trying to establish what you have done, and then I'm going to ask you why you've done it. So there's no need for you to explain why, if that's not the question. That's all I'm. So you exclude Bupa, and we see that at page 1149. See there, that's your table, and that sets out broadly the volume rebate percentages that were being applied to the different parts of the OIC portfolio, yes?
Yes, it's a summary of the split of rebate between Bupa, non-Bupa and total.
And so broadly speaking, we can see that, say for 2015, if one looks forward from 2016 onwards, the Bupa portfolio attracted higher volume rebates, didn't it?
It did.
And I think you accept that once you factor in Bupa, say you were to bring Bupa into your portfolio that you're assuming would be managed by GlobeMed, you do get some volume rebates over the 3-year course of the contracts. and you calculate that at 1.33 million. Remember that?
I do. Again, this is part of my first report, but this should not change materially between my updated calculation and my first report calculation.
I see. All right. So if we go forward to page 1157, and it's paragraph 5.06.60, you say, if the Bupa portfolio did come across, then you would get to a volume rebate over the 3 years of 1.33 million. So on your calculations then, if we include Bupa, we've got out of, presumably, the first slab of volume rebates, and we're now into the slab that would be going entirely to the defendant, yes? And then that, for the next 5 million of each year, all of that goes to the claimant, and then once you exceed 5 million in each year, it switches to the sharing model where 30% goes to the claimant and 70% to the defendant, yes?
Correct.
Would you accept that quite a small increase in the volume rebate percentage during that period could have quite a significant impact on the volume rebate that the claimant was getting? Because any increase in volume rebate creates, percentage creates volume rebate, which goes straight to the claimant.
No, I would not wholeheartedly agree with that. The driver to this increase of 1.3 million is twofold. One is the introduction of Bupa to the portfolio, which we're talking about a 20% increase in lives. So we have to get over that hurdle first. And then it's the slightly, I wouldn't say materially, just slightly increase in rebate percentage that Bupa seems to have earned historically, which then assists it in bumping up the volume rebate figure. So it's a twofold driver rather than a singular causation.
I understand. What I'm suggesting is that any small increase thereafter, the volume rebates, from the historic rates that OIC was attaining, would be reflected entirely in volume rebates that would go to the claimant. And therefore, would you say that the question of how much volume rebate the claimant received was very sensitive to any small increase in the volume rebate rates?
Just so I understand the question, so assuming already that Bupa would be transferred,
correct,
once we got over that hurdle,
yes, correct,
and that uncertainty, then if we were to increase the volume rebates, there would be an impact on the volume rebate calculation, absolutely. In terms of the sensitivity question, I don't know exactly, what percentage, what tenth percentage of volume rebate increase would result in terms of a higher volume rebate value.
Well, but given that these sorts of rates, on average, we're looking at about 1.8, 1.7, 1.5, have resulted in a whole 15 million going to OIC first, and then a little bit going to Bupa. It would be a relatively small proportionate increase in those rates would result in quite a significant, that's my point, result in quite a significant amount going to the claimant, yes?
Again, but the leap that you're taking from no volume rebates to 1.3 is predicated by a jump in lives as well of 20%. So I don't think you can extrapolate the same materiality of increase to the volume rebates if you're just increasing the percentage slightly.
No, I'm asking you to assume the increase in lives, what you describe as 20% increase in lives. So we've got to start from an assumption and work from there. So the fact that we've incorporated that is now irrelevant. You're dealing with a portfolio that includes those lives, that achieves the sort of volume rebates that OIC has achieved. My point is that any increase from there of volume rebate percentages results in a significant benefit to the claimant, because we've come out of the 15 million slab, we're into the 5 million slab, and so it's sensitive to small increases in the volume rebate percentage.
I would agree that any increase in the volume rebate percentage would increase the volume rebate, absolutely. In terms of this, the sensitivity, and if I don't think I'll be able to express myself sufficiently to say that it would significantly increase, but it would have an impact on my calculation.
Your Excellency, I think we might be due a break for the transcriber. Would now be a convenient time to take it? We can.
Shall we take a break for 10 minutes? Or
10 minutes is fine.
we'll break for 10 minutes and come back. Thank you.
Could we please turn to page, I think we might be on it, 1149. And we were looking at your data on the historic OIC volume rebates.
Yes.
And we note, if we look at the final year, do you agree that it looks like the volume rebate more than halves? So the final year volume rebate is less than half of the rate of the year before. Would you agree with
Yes,
that?
more than halves, both for BUPA, non-BUPA, and therefore total.
Yes. Now, did you ask any questions about why that occurred?
From the discussions I had, my understanding is that that there was a changing kind of market dynamic that was, I think, permeating the medical insurance industry, and it resulted in a harder drive downwards on volume rebate percentages.
Right. So you're saying you had conversations with who about this?
This was with the OIC team. Who specifically? It would have been sorry, let me just recollect. So I've forgotten her name, but she was part of the management team who looked after and managed the portfolio.
It would have been someone whose name you very fairly say you can't remember, but you don't remember the actual discussions that you had.
I remember the actual discussions I had, but I don't remember to whom the person I had the discussions with.
All right. Did you look at the data yourself? The underlying data? Interrogate the sources of the data?
Yeah, I think the source of the data that underpins these calculations is exhibited as part of my first reports. But in terms of the actual extraction of the data from the IT systems, no. From the discussions I had, it was very difficult to extract this information, and I know that there are changes in the data sets between previous submissions and the data set that I received in the preparation of my first report, and that's largely due to the fact that even as late as to when this information was being compiled, there are changes to the claims data. So the difference between claim value, claims paid, and also the rebates and the rebate percentages were still in the process of reconciliation. So this would be almost three years post. And I also understand that it was quite a manually heavy process of extracting this data set from the IT team, and it did take some period of time to be able to collate it And unfortunately, I wasn't able to sit at source with the IT team to supervise it. But then again, I don't think I would necessarily need to.
Well, the thing is that when you're dealing with volume rebates, the volume rebate that's achieved or actually received in relation to a year is going to be received in the following year, isn't it? Part of it will be received in the year, part of it will be received in the following year, the year after.
I know that that's Mr. Cottle's assumption. I think that the volume rebates receipts could have taken longer.
Yes. So there's a lag between when they're earned and when they're received. Is that right?
I think there is a lag between the kind of proposition of what should be received and then a negotiation potentially and then a reconciliation of what is actually ended up as being paid from the medical service provider.
Would you accept that if you cut off the data at the end of 2019, won't get all of the information about the volume rebates which were actually earned in respect of that year?
And you would hope that by 2022, the majority of that data in relation to that portfolio would have been compiled. But yes, I agree. It's possible that a proportion is omitted. But I think after 3 years, certainly in terms of a reconciliation process, you'd hope that almost all of it's done.
But one explanation for the drop-off from 1.57% to 0.66% from 2018 to 2019 is that the data extraction process hasn't actually brought in the data from the following years, which would be relevant to 2019. That's one possible explanation for why there is a drop-off, isn't it?
That's one possible explanation. I would say that it's probably not the probable explanation. In fact, I'll be surprised if that's the key driver, if any of the reason for the decrease, given I didn't get this data until November 2022.
So you're judging, are you, the difference in likely, which is more likely, there's something gone wrong with the data extraction process, which you say you haven't managed and you haven't yourself checked, and on the other hand, this suggestion that there's some massive change in market conditions at that precise moment. You're weighing up the probability of those two, are you, in that assessment of what's most likely?
No, I think the other most likely explanation is that the rebate percentage reduced for 2019.
Yes, we know that from the figures it reduced, but you've explained why, your understanding of why it reduced, because without the market change theory, it's very difficult to explain. So what you're doing in assessing, sorry, just wait a second, what you're doing in assessing the likelihood of there's something going wrong with the data extraction is you're weighing up the two explanations for the figures changing. One is something went wrong, or the other is the market change leading to lower rebates. Those are the two explanations that you're presenting, or we're looking at, and you're saying one is more likely than the other. Is that what you're doing?
I'm not presenting that something went wrong in terms of the data collection.
I didn't suggest that you did.
Sorry, I thought that
You're giving evidence. You gave evidence about how likely that was to have been the case. You said you thought it was improbable.
Yes.
And what I was pointing out was that in making that assessment, you are weighing up the likelihood of, on the one hand, an error in the data extraction, which you accept as a possible explanation, dramatic drop in rebates, and on the other hand, the other explanation for the dramatic drop, which is some significant change in market conditions. That's what you're doing, isn't it, when you're making that assessment?
I think the error in the data extraction is a possible explanation, but improbable, potentially highly improbable. And I think the more realistic explanation is the driver is due to the change in market.
Yes, so you're weighing up the two probabilities of those things. Yes.
But one explanation, I think, far outweighs the other, at least in my head, and per the discussions I had as part of vetting this data set.
You've got no personal insight into the market conditions yourself, do you?
No, and this is why I discussed it with people who have better understanding of the market conditions. From what I understand, I think it's very difficult. This is from the market expert evidence. It's very difficult to be able to extract rebate percentages and without leaning on actual data sets. So people that I were having these discussions with had an inside track as to the drivers to the reductions.
And you had no personal insight into precisely what went on in the data collection process, which you accept was difficult, yes?
I didn't oversee the data extraction process, no.
So you're not really in a position to say which is more likely, are you? From your own personal knowledge?
From my own personal knowledge, I think I can only conclude that I would be surprised if there was something materially different or incorrect or erroneous with the data set.
I think if we go to page 11, we're still on 1147, aren't we? Yeah. Actually, where were we? If we go to page 1147, please. So there you've summarised the historical data associated, identifying the volume rebates that were achieved by the claimant on its portfolio between 2009 to 2014. That's what you do there, isn't it?
Yes, I summarise the data that I have at my disposal in relation to GMGHS's rebate percentages and cost per life.
And do you have any insight into what a third-party claims administrator would bring to the process of negotiating volume rebates? Do you have any insight into the benefits that what can be achieved from appointing a third-party administrator for that purpose?
I have a layperson's understanding of what the ATPA entity would want to bring to the party when administering lives on behalf of insurers.
Yeah. One of the reasons for appointing a third-party administrator is that they are able to achieve higher volumes of lives, but also higher volume rebates. Would you accept that?
I understand that that's the intention and the objective, yes.
So you speculate, don't you, in your report? You give some reasons about why you think these higher volume rebates might have been obtained. Because well, start there. It's right, isn't it, that in that period, albeit on a smaller portfolio, the claimant was achieving higher volume rebates, ultimately, at least by 2012, 2011, when it had the largest size of portfolio, than the rebates that were achieved by OIC in the subsequent period. Different period, different lives, but that is true on the numbers.
It's different periods, different lives, different portfolio, potentially. I've not been able to interrogate whether the portfolio is like for like, but on this very small sample of lives, yes, I'd agree that the volume rebates is slightly higher, yeah.
And is it fair to say then it's not really within your expertise to determine, or knowledge, to determine why GLOBEMED was achieving higher rebates in that period and on that portfolio than OIC was achieving during the contractual period?
I would say that as a quantum expert, all I can do is interrogate the data that I have in front of me and try and understand the potential drivers or differences or uncertainties as to whether GMGHS's volume rebates could be automatically extrapolated onto a different portfolio of a larger size.
It doesn't, I mean, that question of whether those rates can be extrapolated will depend on why the claimant was achieving those rates and whether there were any differences, material differences, between the conditions on the different portfolio in the later stage. You're not really in a position to give any views at all on those, whether or not that extrapolation is legitimate.
Well, the only view that I would provide to Your Excellency on this is that we do have cost per life data. And what was stark to me is that the cost per life data for GMGHS is twice as high as OIC's. And that almost plays into my understanding of how a negotiation works between a TPA or an insurer with a medical service provider, in the sense that what you effectively bring to the table is two discussions with a hospital. One is the cost effectively for treatment, which is referred to as the tariff, and then the other is the volume rebate, so the subsequent deductions that you get on a volume basis. And just in terms of kind of market dynamics, if you push very, very hard in terms of achieving a very good tariff, you're losing some bargaining power in terms of the volume rebates. You can't take with one hand and take with the other. And I think it's, from what I understand, it's a point of evidence that as part of this proposed TPA agreement and joint venture, GMGHS would take on the tariffs of OIC because it was better. And this is borne out by the cost per life data that we have. OIC's cost per life is less, which to me is representative of the better tariff. And the question that I would therefore have is, if GMGHS does adopt the better tariff, would it have the bargaining power, in the other hand, to be able to drive the volume rebates to the extent that it might wish?
Just given an explanation of your understanding of the value that TPAs bring, the market, none of that is within your field of expertise, is it? You're an accountant, yes?
As part of a forensic accountant, you take data sets and try and understand the underlying rationale. Obviously, I'm not a market expert, and I wouldn't profess to be. But I think these nuances in terms of the data set are, I think, important to raise, to try and get the context of what GMGHS's portfolio and rebates potentially portray, and what OIC's portfolio potentially portray.
And one of the things you speculate on is that the better rebates might have something to do with higher tariffs, but you've actually got no data on those tariffs at all, have you?
I don't have any data. I can refer to Mr. Saliba's evidence, and also I think it is stated in the TPA that the best tariffs would be adopted, and I understand that was OIC.
Now, we talked about the sensitivity of the volume rebate sum to the percentage of rebate that would be applied to the total claims. Now, obviously, if you had, you've calculated it, if you include Bupa at 1.33 million dirhams, we put it. If you include a fourth year, then there would presumably also be some volume rebates in relation to that year that would need to be added.
Yes, if you were to include BUPA and add a fourth year, yes.
And you are aware, aren't you, that there's a debate between the parties about whether or not GlobeMed would have been able to attract more business other than OIC lives by leveraging its market position as a result of managing those lives. You're aware of that debate?
I'm aware of those discussions and debates, yes.
And I'm not asking you to take a position on any of that. But if we were to carry in those lives, those 137,000 lives by the end of Mr. Cottle's calculation, that presumably would also have likely resulted in an increase in volume rebates. Is that right?
Yes, it would likely, yes.
And if any of that had happened, it would likely have therefore increased your estimate of 1.3 million dirhams to something larger. Do you have any sense of what that increase would be likely to be? Would it, for example, take up the second slab of 5 million dirhams?
So just so I understand the premise, if we're just building on assumptions here, so 3 years to 4 years.
Yes.
BUPA is included.
Yes.
And volume rebates are then applied to Mr. Cottle's non-OIC lives.
Yes.
Then yes, you would receive more rebates, and I would expect that it would start to exceed that 5 million secondary slab.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. All right. Look, thank you very much. I think that's all I'm going to deal with you on the top line, as you put it, the administrative fees and the volume rebates. And I'm going to come on. Oh no, sorry, I do have a few further questions. But the point, when it comes to the cost of the operations, you rely primarily on the projections in the schedule to the MOU, don't you?
I would define it as an adjusted or a flexed model of the MOU, which is underpinned by the projections in the MOU, but where relevant and where updated contemporaneous data is available, and where it seems reasonable to, I do replace aspects of the MOU. For instance, rent, I think, is a good example, where GMGHS has made grounds to effectively put together a shortlist of the new rental, a new rental property to look after the additional headcount that's required for the transfer of lives.
So your position is that the MOU is a reasonable starting point for basing your projections of cost?
I do, on the basis that for costs especially, there was co-input from OIC and GMGHS. It is underpinned by an extraordinarily large amount of detail, which can be kind of reviewed and I think understood. So yes, in conclusion, I think it's a good starting point, especially for costs, given that it was prepared just prior to the potential launch date, so December 2014, I understand, and it was agreed by both parties, and therefore I expect to be cross-referenced and vetted and refined.
Well, I was going to come on and ask you about the differences between the two approaches to costs, but I have quite specific and narrow questions, okay. Very long answer, and I'm not, we've got all day, but if we try and just focus in on the question and if we look at page 2105, we see an appendix to the MOU. see there's projections about 5 lines down for volume rebates from providers. Year 1, we've got 5,175, year 2, 8,233, year 3, 8,643. And you see below that, below gross revenues, you've got volume rebate, profit share to guarantors provision. And so there's a deduction, and that's the amount that goes to the OIC side of the equation. So the amount that is being kept by the claimant is the first number in the first year, 5,175, minus the second number in the first year, 3,453. So that's the projection of the volume rebate that the claimant would receive. Yes?
Yes, I see that projection in the
Right. And so in the first year, they're keeping about 1.7 million. Do you agree that that is about 20% of the net revenue that was projected for that year, just on the numbers? We'll come back to the significance of the numbers in a minute.
1.7 million on
Gross revenue is
On
11.87, 11,875.
Yep.
Yeah. So it's about 20%. Is that right?
A bit less than that, but 14%. 1.7 on 11.8.
Oh, sorry, I'm doing the calculation on net revenue. So it's 3,453 against 8. So the percentage of net revenue is about 20%. It's my mistake. I do apologise.
Okay.
And in the second year, I make it about 16%, and in the third year, about 14%. Does that look about right to you?
6 over 13.
No, it'll be 8,800,8233 minus 6.
Ah, sorry. Yeah. Yep, I'm sure that's right.
Take your time.
Yep.
So it's
About 15%.
projecting about 20% of net revenue in the first year, 16% of net revenue in the second year, and 14% in the third year will be volume rebates. Now, on Mr. Cottle's calculation of volume rebates, he comes in at around 9.5% of net revenue. Do you accept that?
I would have to do the figures.
Do them if you want to. We go to page 1396. And I think the figure is 17 divided by 73.
9%.
9.5%. So looking at it like that, would you say that actually Mr. Cottle's estimate of volume rebates was quite conservative when you compare it to what was projected?
Would to compare it to what is projected, is obviously it is lower as a percentage terms, but I do question whether we should be comparing in terms of volume rebates what the MOU is projecting as a benchmark.
Well, but put it like this. I mean, if we look at the MOU projections, standing at that point in time, it would be quite surprising, wouldn't it, if the result of 3 years of project would result in a 0% volume rebate, or zero money in terms of volume rebate for the claimant.
I suppose it would depend on the market dynamics at the time as to whether it's surprising to OIC and GMJHS.
If you are relying on these projections for the costings, can you not at least use them to sense check your calculations in relation to the volume rebate projections, where there's a much more higher degree of estimation than there is in relation to the administration fees?
I'd agree with you that there is a very high level of kind of estimation in terms of the volume rebates that's put forward as part of the MOU. I think it's much more rational and supportable to be able to use actual rebate percentages on the reflective portfolio at the exact or relevant period of time. So yes, I think there are aspects of the MOU specifically in relation to revenue that I think struggle to support based on the actual information that I have available through the OIC portfolio and the claims paid and the volume rebates. As a result, I think it's sensible to me that they should be effectively replaced with that more robust actual data.
But isn't it at least of some value, once you've done your calculations and you've done your best to estimate what the volume rebates would have been, to go back and sense check it against what everybody thought at the beginning of the project? There's some value in that.
There is some value, and in terms of a cross-reference for revenue and volume rebates, I obviously realise that there was a difference in relation to the MOU. Again, unfortunately, I was not able to discuss what the assumptions were in terms of those kind of rebate numbers being included within the MOU with the parties that drafted it.
Now I am going to move on from volume rebates and talk to you a little bit about costs. So we've got page 1396 up on the screen, I believe, and that's Mr. Cottle's calculation of the costs. And the major line of costs is the payroll. It's not everything, but it's a lot. It's a very significant part. It's the most significant element of the costs, would you say?
I would say, yes.
All right.
About 50% of just under 50% of the revenue.
Yes, quite. And then obviously rent is significant, and then there are issues of principle in relation to depreciation. But what I'm going to ask you about is two, which are the payroll costs and the general costs. All right. Now, your position in relation to those two, we can see on page 1399. And you can see, thank you.
Yes.
So you can see there the costs are set out in the third box down, and they start less fixed cost savings and so forth. And then, so you've got payroll in salaries and allowances, and that corresponds to Mr. Cottle's payroll numbers, yes?
Mr. Cottle's?
That's the same category as Mr. Cottle has.
Sorry.
Just talking about the categories.
The category is the same.
Very
yes.
good.
Although, I think there are aspects of the category within salaries and allowances which provides more detail in my calculations. So there are additional subcategories within salaries and allowances compared to Mr. Cottle's.
Yes, all right. I'm just trying to see what we're comparing so the judge can take a view. So he needs to know what the differences are. So all I'm doing is trying to help to establish what those differences are. So then you see below salaries, you see rental and depreciation, and we'll leave those aside for one moment. But is it right then that everything below that, legal and professional, insurance, travelling, IT support, telephone and internet, and other general expenses, all of those are the same category as Mr. Cottle puts together under the heading general expenses?
Yes.
Yes. So when he's put a total cost of 15.1 million, to get a comparison of that total cost, we've got to add up all these various categories. And I think you know what I'm going to ask you to do next. So because we need to be trying to make sure we are comparing like for like and understand what the differences are, because the judge will have to make a decision on some of this. So if we add up...
In the interest of comparing like with like, obviously I'm looking at a 3-year period.
Of course.
Cottle's looking at a 4-year period.
Of course, yes, of course. And we'll come back to that distinction in a moment.
And there are other kind of nuances of distinction which would feed into these fixed costs as well.
They largely focus on things like
Headcount.
Headcount, yes, which is one of the issues that arises in relation to payroll. Yes, so we will talk about that. But just to get this comparable, so if we add up all those categories that I identified, from legal and professional down to other general, I make it a total over 3 years of 4,279,633.
Yeah, broadly 4 million, yes.
Yeah, I've got 4,279,633. All right, and if we make that into dirhams, I get that at 15.7 million dirhams, but tell me if I'm wrong.
Say 4.23.
I get 4.279. Thank you, all right. Okay, so that's what we are comparing, albeit there are differences between your two models, because you've got 3 years and he's got 4 years, and these other distinctions. Now, it might be possible to cut through some of this in this way, though. You come in the broad sense, you come in partly at a lower cost because you are assuming a lower number of lives, and because you are assuming 3 years and not 4 years. That's right, isn't it?
Yes, so I am including a lower number of lives, but also a lower headcount per number of lives.
Yes, quite. But would you agree with me on this? And bear in mind, if you don't, we're going to take a detour through some numbers. But if you were working from the same assumptions on years and on headcount, not on headcount, but because you have a different approach to headcount, but on years and lives, would you agree that when you put together general costs and payroll costs, come out at basically the same place?
That could be, well, I know from experience that's it's a difficult exercise to do. But if you're amalgamating salaries and allowances,
Yes.
Where my saving is lower and therefore my calculation is higher than Cottle, and that's because I'm adopting the MOU's assumptions. Inversely, the general expenses, Saliba's general expense estimates are significantly lower than the very detailed, granular general expenses reflection that you get as part of the Appendix 2. Now, all things being equal is a difficult question to answer. I think I would broadly say that they would mostly balance each other out, potentially.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Cottle said that yesterday. His view was, all things being equal on the assumptions, if you put those things together, payroll and general costs, including all the subcategories that we've looked at, you and he come out pretty much the same place. Have you got any reason have you done that calculation?
I have attempted to do that calculation. I think where it gets a little bit difficult is that whether they cancel each other out really depends on what assumptions you're applying in the gross revenue portion. So the impact of the delta in terms of it's downstream from the impact on assumptions that you adopt with lives, because there's a direct correlation between the lives and head counts in both mine and Mr. Cottle's calculation. So all things being equal, I think it would result in a different answer if all things were being equal per, let's say, Cottle's gross revenue assumptions versus my gross revenue assumptions.
Your gross revenue assumptions turn only, we've established this, on 3 differences. 3 years or 4 years, on Bupa, and on the 50,000 lives. So if those issues were resolved, then when one looks at these 2 categories put together, I thought that you had agreed with me that all things being equal on that front, you would get to the same number.
I think what I'm trying to just segregate is it's important to understand what we mean by all things being equal. If all things being equal mean that we agree to Cottle's top line, I think Cottle would, and it seems to have conceded that all things being equal, it does effectively cancel each other out. But
you agree with that? Sorry to interrupt.
If you were to go up to his projections of 4 years,
yes,
50,000 lives.
So you agree.
But if all things being equal were to come down to my numbers, then I think that there isn't potentially a balancing out, because the representative impact on general expenses would be larger than the reduction that I have on salaries.
Right.
I hope that clarifies.
So it does to a certain extent, but I asked you the question, have you done the calculation? Have you done the calculation? You said yes. So what were the results of that calculation when you did it?
So the results of that calculation were that, because I did it from the perspective of Cottle reducing down to my numbers.
Right.
So all things being equal on 3 years, etc., etc. Then the general expenses would outweigh the smaller saving that I calculate.
By how much?
Don't know off the top of my head.
You're able to give us an explanation of a calculation that you have done.
The mechanism of the calculation.
Yeah. I mean, you've got to answer the question. What is the ballpark for this number?
Doing my best. I think the probably the upside in terms of my costs being higher is probably in the region of 1 to 2 million dirhams. That's an estimate.
Over the 3 years?
Over the 3 years. Happily check that figure if required.
Just to understand. Yes, of course.
But I think we have an issue with the IT. 2 minutes, Mohammed? Yeah. Right, apologize for that.
Not at all, Your Excellency. Thank you. All right. So just to summarise all of that, then, if you accept Mr. Cottle's assumptions, well, it's not really his assumptions, but if you accept the assumptions on the basis of his report, 3 years, the Bupa, the 50k lives, and therefore you get to his 180 million in revenue, then
4 years.
Sorry, 4 years. 4 years. Thank you. Start that again. I realise it's a confusing question. So if you accept the assumptions that underpin his report, 4 years, the Bupa, the 50,000 lives, 180 million in administration fees, and obviously you can disagree about volume rebates. You would therefore, would you, I take it, quibble with the way he gets to his total on payroll and costs, but you would accept his payroll and costs figure, effectively.
Yes, I would disagree with the process in getting to those numbers, to the extent that they would cancel each other out if they were to, and I think it's Mr. Cottle's evidence that it does, and my understanding is that it would broadly cancel each other out on his assumptions. Then it's effectively a point.
Yeah, so there wouldn't be a disagreement, I think. And then if all of those assumptions went the other way, 3 years, no Bupa, no 50,000 lives, you would disagree with how he gets to his numbers, but you would say that there's an issue between you over the full term of the contract of 1 to 2 million dirhams.
Yes, that's my estimate, yeah.
And obviously,
I suppose in the scheme of things, we would be fairly close. Yeah.
I mean, you'd be very close in the question as to the actual profit that would come out at the end, wouldn't you? Very close.
Not the actual profit, because there are a number of other issues.
Yeah, we'll come on to those issues. But we're talking about the impact of this discrete two categories of cost.
It's important I just clarified that point. So, specifically in relation to rental and costs, then we're in the similar ballpark.
Payroll and costs, I think you mean.
Payroll and costs.
Yeah.
We're in the same ballpark.
All right. And so you come at it from different angles. You start with the MOU and you flex it, as you put it. He uses figures from Mr. Saliba. But the fact that both of those different ways of approaching it reach essentially the same numbers must give you some confidence that you have arrived at a reasonable assessment of what those costs would be when added together.
Some level of comfort, yeah.
And if it matters, I mean, you understand the value of talking to a person to interrogate the assumptions on general costs, for example, on payroll, for example, on headcount, and so forth. You understand why it adds value to be able to have someone to explain those assumptions, yes?
Yes, as long as there'd been a thorough discussion as to why those assumptions have changed from somebody else's assumptions, who was involved in the nitty-gritty of forming a very complicated and complex projection.
Yes, but I mean, if somebody says, look, from the business that I'm running now, for every 100,000 lives, this is the amount of the personnel and headcount we have, that's going to be a valuable resource as compared to, say, a rough estimate of that.
Are you attributing the MOU headcount per 100,000 lives a rough estimate? Or?
Well, I'm asking you the question in the abstract, and then I'll move on to the practicality of the MOU. So I'm not so as opposed to a rough estimate, it's better to have someone who knows the business.
Yes, in that specific hypothetical, it is sometimes better. Yeah, I'd agree that to discuss, have the opportunity for that dialogue if it's available.
So if we go to page 407. this statement? L.L.C. And if we look at paragraph 8.1, Mr. Al-Khatib says the financial models contained within Annex 2 of the MOU were simply rough estimates and no more than best guess predictions, which are uncertain and unclear, made by representatives at the time of preparing and signing the MOU. I mean, if he's right that those were rough estimates, then it's perfectly reasonable to turn to Mr. Saliba and say, well, actually, what, for example, headcount do you use?
Having been through the Annex 2 to the MOU in a fair amount of detail and understanding the granularity and the level of depth of assumption that effectively feeds up to the costings, I would disagree with the representation that they were simply rough estimates in terms of costings.
You think you know more about the way in which the MOU financial models were prepared than Mr. Al-Khatib, is that what you're saying?
I'm just disagreeing with the way that he's represented the perception of the MOU.
But that depends on whether, in fact, it was a rough estimate at the time that it was made. You can have lines which themselves are rough estimates. Isn't that all about facts that you have no insight into at all, isn't it?
Well, I mean, I would term a rough estimate kind of back of the cigarette packet type of estimate. This is a document with more than 20 tabs and many lines.
And I think it's got many lines, but do you understand the point that Mr. Cotter was making about spurious accuracy? In other words, you can make a very detailed projection and have lots of numbers in it and do lots of detailed calculations and calculate them to the nth decimal point. And actually, that doesn't add anything to the accuracy of the projection. All you're doing is compounding a series of calculations. Do you understand what he means by spurious accuracy, and do you think that's a fair comment on the way the MOU is prepared?
I don't think it. I don't know if I can completely agree with Mr. Cottle's representation there. From my perspective, the MOU was a very detailed document prepared by Mr. Tomey, who was the general manager at the time with GMGHS. Now, I don't know to what extent he was heavily, involved in testing the assumptions, but I understand that he effectively signed it off, if I can use that turn of phrase. So to place a reliance on Mr. Saliba's general expenses, which were prepared after the fact, and as I understand, specifically for the purposes of this dispute, I think it's difficult for me to conclude that, given that context, that Mr. Saliba's estimates should overrule Mr. Tomey's.
But as we've discussed, ultimately it doesn't make a huge amount of difference, because the difference on when you add up payroll in general is somewhere between nothing and 1 or 2 million dirhams. It doesn't actually make a lot of difference to us, does it?
In the scheme of things.
One area where you do disagree is on the question of amortization. So I'm going to ask you a few questions about that. Now, this issue, as I understand it, relates to 2 assets which were identified on the books of the claimant. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Yep. And the first of those related to the purchase by the claimant of the network of the offshore GLOBEMED company that was providing TPA services before the claimant. Yes?
It's referred to as the network or know-how that was purchased in 2013 as part of the incorporation of GMGHS.
That's right, and the purchase price was 11.5 million dirhams. Do you remember that?
Do.
Very good. All right. Do you know what that was for? What was the network and know-how?
I don't think there's a huge amount of detail as to a representation of what that is. I imagine it is a combination of the know-how of the business, the IT infrastructure, potentially, and the software that's available, and the contact base.
So if someone was to say that the word...
GMGHS.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, I do apologise. If someone was to say that in the TPA world, network normally means providers, that is healthcare providers, you wouldn't know whether that is what's being referred to or something else.
Sorry, in terms, sorry, just so I understand the question, network, are you potentially saying that the network could relate to the network of service providers rather than the IT infrastructure network?
Well, if someone was, I'm not suggesting either way, but if someone was to suggest that, you wouldn't know whether that was right or wrong, would you?
No, without the agreement in hand, which I don't think is in evidence, or at least I've not seen.
All right, and so what has happened is that in the accounts, this asset has been amortized, or this price has been amortized over a period of years. I think 10 years, is that right?
It was due to be amortized over 10 years, yeah.
Due to be amortized over 10 years, and that stopped at some point. All right,
stopped in December 2017.
December 2017, correct. But the purchase happened in 2013. That's, we know, before the negotiations between the parties. So you're not suggesting that the purchase had anything to do with the TPA agreement itself?
Not necessarily with the specific TPA agreement, but for the purposes of going about its business, it would have been relevant.
Well, would you accept that, all things being equal, by the time the TPA agreement services were to be, well, the agreement was to be performed, that would have been a sunk cost? Would you accept that characterisation?
Depends if you're referring to a sunk cost from a cash perspective or not. It's incurred. I'd agree it's incurred prior to the commencement or the proposed commencement of the TPA, but again, I don't have any information as to when or how, more pertinently, the purchase was made. Was it cash up front, or is it being paid over installments?
Yeah. All right, but as I understand your point, as it emerges in the joint statement, your point, the reason why you include this cost in the profit analysis is because of the transfer that takes place in 2017, December 2017.
The sellback, yes.
What's described in the accounts as a sellback, yes? And so as I understand your position, you're suggesting that firstly, the transfer, or the sellback, as you call it, might have been the result of the cancellation of the agreement. And then secondly, you suggest, well, if it was transferred in December 2017, it might have been transferred sooner.
Yes, there are two elements to that, absolutely.
Right. So it's a mitigation point that you're making. You're saying effectively they should or could, possibly, we don't know, but there might be a case that it could have been transferred earlier, and then that would have saved that book cost.
That's the second part of the argument, which brings forward the saving by potentially 1 year on a mitigation basis. Yes.
Yeah, but if we look
or at least in absence of understanding why it couldn't have been brought forward.
But if we look at the first part of the argument, that is that the transfer back had something to do with the cancellation of the third-party services, the third-party administration agreement. You don't personally have any information either way, do you?
No, I don't. But from a forensic accounting kind of perspective, it seems more than coincidental where you have an asset such as the know-how, which is, as I understand it, would be required for the performance of the TPA. And I think this is an important point, it's assumed as part of the MOU Appendix 2 P&L to be a cost to the joint venture or the TPA agreement, which would seem to demonstrate that it was a cost reflecting the revenues that would be brought in, and would continue to be a cost going forward. So under the MOU, it's a cost relevant to, the Appendix 2 to the MOU, it's a cost relevant to the joint venture. When the TPA didn't commence or post the purported termination or cancellation, it stopped being a cost. I think the rational conclusion that I draw, in absence of any other supporting documentation, is that there was a causal link between the cancellation and the sellback of the know-how,
and
resulting in a potential saving.
And the starting point of that is that you assume that the know-how, and it's also the network, that's what it relates to, yes, would be required for the performance of the TPA agreement. That's your starting assumption in that.
Yes.
Thank you. So if you were shown, for example, page 1986, for example, a document which comes from the negotiations of the parties, and you see there Ms. Hajar Fadel, who you may not know, comes from OIC, emailing, amongst others, Mr. Saliba, saying, "Hi Roger, in addition to PJ's email below, kindly know that OIC has a larger network than GLOBEMED's and enjoys far greater discounts. On this basis, we had previously agreed to use OIC's network, and subsequently we see no justification to pay a goodwill for your network." So, and then you see above, again, Roger Saliba, as for the network, it was previously agreed upon that you will not pay for it for the same reasons you mentioned below. And so it looks, at least from that, doesn't it, that the parties agreed that the network would not, in fact, be used to service the TPA. That just focusing on the network, that's what it looks like from that, doesn't it?
If we were to focus on the network, so just so I've not seen this document before, so as I understand it, so GLOBEMED is saying that it's
OIC is saying, we're not going to pay for your network because we've got our own network and we don't need to use your network. The response comes back, yes, we agreed for the reasons you say. But the network, at least, was not necessary for the TPA services agreement. We can agree on that from this. If that's the conclusion of the negotiations, then that must be right, yes?
That's the conclusion, but I also understand that this relates to know-how.
We'll focus on the network for the moment.
Okay.
For the network,
yes.
If that is the conclusion of the agreements, you can agree with me that it looks like GLOBEMED did not need the network part of this asset to service the TPA services agreement. Looking at that document.
I'm not sure if I can make connections between what's been specified here and the know-how that was incorporated as part of GMGHS.
Well, we agreed that it was for the network and the know-how, and we talked quite a bit about the network aspect.
I think we said it could possibly be for the network.
So you don't know. Well, I think the point that I'm making about this is that you don't know. Doesn't this show that in order to determine what role that particular asset had to play in the performance of the TPA services agreement depends entirely on the facts on the ground about which you have no idea? That's the real answer to the question, isn't it? I don't know.
I don't know if that's... I think I've raised queries, and I think they are understandable queries based on the information that I have, that both that the MOU and the Appendix 2 to the MOU was assuming that this would be a continuing cost. If the TPA were to go ahead, and it stopped being a cost post-termination or post-purported termination of the TPA.
I appreciate you're going back to the summary of the position, and I was trying to get into some of the detail of that. So let's not go back to the big picture. Let's focus on what we're talking about.
I do think the big picture is important, because it's difficult to, just reading this, especially for the first time, to make a strong connection between what is referenced here as network and what we're talking about in terms of established know-how.
But don't you think that in order to understand whether or not that particular booked asset was required for the performance of the TPA services agreement, the person to ask about that appears to be someone involved in these discussions? For example, Mr. Saliba. He would know better than you, wouldn't he?
Yes, yeah, he would know. He would know better than me. I think that's fair to say. Although, I think it's important to, and I didn't get a kind of response as part of the process of doing my joint statement, but ideally, through the course of drafting my final calculation, evidence would be presented to be able to understand this point better.
And if we think about the actual transfer, we've got to know what the asset is to understand why it was transferred back, don't we?
I think you could probably ask the question as to why it was sold back, even not fully understanding what the intangible pertained to.
For example, isn't it effectively just writing off the debt? Because GLOBEMED's not, the other entity on the other side of this transaction isn't actually buying back its own know-how, is it? It's not actually getting anything, is it?
It's getting something in the sense that, per the financial statements, a debtor is being raised to its parent company, which is unwound over future years, as I understand it.
But no cash passes hands in this transaction, as far as you can see.
I don't have enough information to determine whether any cash passes hands. It seems to me that it's possible that cash may have passed hands as part of a reconciliation exercise, with this being a feature within that reconciliation exercise.
So are you suggesting positively that you think cash passed hands in relation to that transaction?
I'm saying I don't know.
You don't know. All right. Well, so you're speculating that cash might have passed hands.
I can say definitively that in the financial statements, a debtor was raised to the parent company, and that debtor reduced over time. But I don't know why it reduced over time, whether it was through the payment of cash or not.
And is it right that you don't include the costs for this part of the amortization in your calculation of the startup costs?
I'm not sure if I understand the question.
When you calculate the startup costs for GLOBEMED, is it right that you do not incorporate in that calculation provision for these amortization costs?
Take me to the paragraph in my report that you're
I'm afraid. Do we have a reference for that?
Are you referring to the reliance loss?
Yes. Yes.
Yes. So, yes, I don't.
So do I take it from that you don't consider that those costs were incurred as a result of the TPA?
Yes, but again, you can incur a cost of something, but then as a result of an event, that cost might cease. And then, therefore, there might be a saving, which needs to be calculated as to the claimant.
But ultimately, would you accept that this all turns on whether the court decides that there's been a failure to mitigate in relation to that asset or the transfer of that asset back, and whether or not that, if something else had been done and sooner, it would have resulted in some sort of actual saving to the claimant? Is it?
No, I would say that a proportion of my deduction pertains to the mitigation argument, and that's just 1 year of it. that the majority of the deduction pertains to the fact that it's ceased, as in a cost that was accrued in the financial statements ceased at a specific point in time, and therefore on a loss of profit basis of calculation, that would result in a saving.
And is your analysis the same for the license fee?
It is the same in the sense, but the context is slightly different. So the license fee actually wasn't sold back; it was written off. So that would actually result in effectively the carrying amount of the license hitting the P&L, hitting the profits and loss account in one specific year, rather than it being spanned out into future years over its useful life. The question that I've raised in terms of the license fee is slightly different, in the sense that, given that the license fee also pertains to know-how, systems, system maintenance and repairs, and it was also a payment to the parent company, then was there a possibility of the sale back of the license fee occurring, and therefore also mitigating the loss and reducing the loss to the claimant?
So you're contemplating that instead of just arranging for the debt to be written off, they should have sold back their license to the person who issued that license?
Sold back the license to their parent company,
Who issued the license?
Who issued the license fees to their subsidiary. Yeah,
and gave the license.
It's not being used.
So you're suggesting that the parent company would buy back the right to do something that their licenses?
Again, I think it depends on what you mean by the license.
All right, and just taking these two together, I mean, you're not saying, sitting here today, that your view is that this really should have been done at any particular earlier date, and it was unreasonable not to do it at some earlier date. You can't say that, can you?
I think it's a question as to why, but the why is underpinned by the reasons as to why it was sold back, which to me seems to be related to the cancellation of the TPA.
But that's as far as you can take it?
As far as I can take it, yeah.
All right. Let me ask you about ASP hosting next, if I may. If we go to page 1638, it's bundle F, sorry. I should make that clear. F1 for those with... So this is the schedule which sets out the fees for ASP hosting. Is that right? You've seen this before?
Yes, and it's also replicated in the MAU as part of the Appendix 2 to the MAU as part of its many tabs.
Thank you. All right. And so once you know the numbers of lives, you can plug that in and it will spit out the cost associated with ASP hosting, yes? Right. So, and the result of that is that as between you and Mr. Cottle gives a higher cost for this and therefore a lower profit as a result, because he is estimating more lives and a longer period. Is that right?
Yes, he's calculating higher losses and therefore higher variable cost savings, which effectively the ASP fee structure is. If you don't have the lives, then you don't need to pay the ASP fee structure, and therefore that cost is saved.
I think, in fairness, I think there is a slight further distinction between you and Mr. Cottle, because he calculate over the contractual period the ASP fees, and then for the period where he says, well, GlobeMed would have had other lives, he makes a deduction which he attributes to the other lives.
Yes. It's a proration or an allocation.
Correct, and his allocation results in a slightly lower cost for the non-OIC, on the non-OIC. Sorry, for the OIC.
Okay.
Sorry, it's been going on for a while now. So.
Due to the fact that because ASP fee structures is effectively tiered, then yes, if you were to apportion the costs across two different portfolios, it might mean that there is a slight mismatch in terms of apportioning what I apply to the OIC portfolio and what he segregates between OIC and non-OIC.
I think the point, though, isn't it, is that if you were to reach a landing on the three main issues, length of contract, BUPA, 50,000 lives, you quite quickly get to a number which you would both be happy with.
Yes. In relation to ASP.
And, yeah, all right, that's fine.
I think, Mr. Smith, we're going to stop here because it seems to me we have, again, an IT problem with the witness camera.
Ah, very good. Well, if it's a convenient time to take a lunch break, just so you know, on a progress update, I might need another half an hour.
See you again after the lunch break. Bye, Smith. Thank you.
All right.
Right.
Mr. Burrows, we were talking briefly about ASP hosting as one of the items of cost associated with this. I just wanted to ask you about a couple of other items of cost. The first is this question of depreciation. And if we go through to page 1390, this is a part of the joint statement. And you're dealing here with the difference between you and Mr. Cottle in respect to depreciation costs and so forth. Just so we understand it, the depreciation here is of mostly of the IT equipment, is that right?
Yes, mostly the IT equipment.
And the difference between you is that you've taken a depreciation period of 3 years. Mr. Cottle's taken a depreciation period of 4.5 years. That's the main difference between
That's
them.
the main difference, yeah.
All right, so it doesn't affect the amount that is allocated to depreciation over the full course of the contract. It just affects when that cost is recorded as taking place. Is that right?
Yeah, the difference in amount is dealt with as part of the general expenses section.
Yes.
What we're dealing with here is the period over which IT equipment is reduced and the useful asset life of that IT equipment.
Yes. And so it's about, it really goes to effectively the calculation of the interest, does it? In the sense that it's about when the cost is recorded as being incurred rather than whether the cost is recorded as being incurred. Is that right?
Yes, that's broadly right, yeah.
And so as I understand it, the actual cost which you're depreciating in relation to this is about 1.8 million dirhams. Does that sound about right? Doesn't say it, I'm afraid, in the joint statement, and it's not easy to get out of the rest of it. But that was Mr. Cottle's statement.
Can we go to Mr. Cottle's statement?
No, that was his statement in court yesterday.
But can we go to his joint statement calculation, just to confirm that?
Joint statement calculation. Oh, I see. Sorry. You want the page? What, the schedule? You mean?
Scheduled, yeah. Appendix 1 to the joint statement.
Yeah. 1396. Yes, thank you. Is that what you mean?
Yes, so the depreciation line would be dealt with there, about halfway down the table.
I see. So your argument is about the full amount of that or part of it? I'd understood you were having...
Yeah, it's part of it.
It's only part of it. So I think the part of it that Mr. Cottle was suggesting, it's quite difficult to get to the numbers, but does it sound about right? that when you're having an argument about 3 or 4.5 years, you're really arguing about 1.8 million dirhams. Depreciation of the cost being 1.8 million dirhams.
I'm not sure if I quite understand your question.
You're having an argument about, or disagreement, about whether or not a certain amount of cost should be depreciated over a period of 3 years or a period of 4.5 years.
Yes, all else being equal, the cost is effectively crystallized within our periods of review. It's how drawn out that cost is extended.
And it's not about the whole of that cost, it's about a specific part of that cost. Is that right?
Not the whole of this 3.8 million.
Yes.
Yes, it's a part of that 3.8 million.
And the part in relation to which there is a disagreement, 3 or 4.5, Mr. Cottle put it at about 1.8 million. Would you agree with that?
I would need to double check. Off the top of my head, I don't have a figure that would disagree with that.
But I mean, ultimately, it really comes down to not the amount of depreciation, but effectively it resolves itself into the time cost of the money. Is that right?
That is right, yeah.
So the impact would be on the interest calculation, not on the 1.8 million or whatever it may be out of that sum that we were looking at.
Again, there are two differences, but yes, the bigger difference in relation to the depreciation aspect. Obviously, you've got the amount that's to be depreciated.
Yes.
There's a delta there, but the bigger impact would pertain to the timing over which that is depreciated.
But what I think the point I'm making is it's not going to make a huge difference to your overall calculation of the profit and the loss, is it?
It affects the interest calculation.
Yes, exactly. That was the point I was putting to you earlier. So, but it's not going to make a very large difference, is it, on the interest calculation? Because we're just talking about, what, 1.5 years of interest, effectively, or half of 1.5 years of interest at the rate that you have applied.
It's one of the smaller drivers to the difference in interest calculation between me and Mr. Cottle.
And so, would you be able to put a figure on that?
I would need to go to my schedules just to do a working.
Would you say that it's something in the order of 10, 20, 30,000 dirhams in total?
I would be guessing.
Guessing. All right. But the reason for the difference, so the purpose of depreciating the asset, the way in which you select the period for the depreciation of the asset is by taking the expectation of the reasonable life of the asset. Would you accept that?
Yes, the depreciation period is reflective of the useful asset life.
I see. And so if you were to assume that IT equipment which was bought at the beginning of the project would be used for the whole of the project, be it 3 years or 4 years, then you would assume that the depreciation period would follow the length of that project?
Not necessarily. Computer equipment might have to be replaced more regularly than 4.5 years. From my understanding, the standard practice of IT equipment is usually 3 years.
That's the standard practice for accounting, yes. But I mean, if you got to the end of the 3rd year of this project and everyone's using IT equipment and notice is given of termination of the agreement, you're not suggesting that you would expect everybody to then invest in more IT equipment. Wouldn't they just use what they have? That's the debate, really, isn't it?
From an accounting perspective, you'd expect it to be depreciated over 3 years, and then there might not be a depreciation amount on the 4th or the 4.5 year if the computer isn't replaced.
But then looking backwards, if the period of depreciation is by reference to the reasonable life of the assets, if we assume that they're not going to be replacing all this IT equipment with new after 3 years, can't we just say, well, now we know that the project was only going to last, on this hypothesis, 4 years with a half-year runoff, that the reasonable life of the asset was 4.5 years. That's a reasonable way to approach it, isn't it?
It's an alternative way of approaching it. I wonder whether there might be some disconnect between how the IT equipment is depreciated, and a default position would be to the standard period of 3 years, and then in the 4th year there is no depreciation charge. So in the books, I wouldn't be surprised if the depreciation is front-ended, and that as a result there is no depreciation charge in the 4th half final period.
All right, and another aspect, if we go back to, well, let's not bother actually. There is a difference between you, isn't there, on the rent that was to be paid, that would have been paid by the claimant, or would have been required to be paid by the claimant had this contract gone forward, yes?
There is a difference in the rental cost saving in my calculation versus Mr. Cottle's calculation. That the main driver to that is the headcount, and the driver to the headcount is the lives. So I would say that the majority of the difference between myself and Mr. Cottle on rent is stemming from the difference in lives. During our joint statement process, we did close the gap on rental costs, whereby I adopted, as Mr. Cottle did, the Blue Bay Tower office premises as being the new premises in which GMGH. Around about the first quarter of 2016, there's a bit of difference between the timing between Mr. Cottle and I, mainly because his lives results in headcounts ramping up faster. So I think all being equal in terms of lives, there isn't an underlying kind of methodology difference between myself and Mr. Cottle. Slight nuance in the sense that because of my head count, I only require 1 floor of Blue Bay Tower, whereas Mr. Cottle requires 2.
So all things being equal, it would be pretty close.
Yes.
But there is a bit of difference, because I think, as you say, your model requires more headcount overall. Your model requires less headcount overall, and therefore less office space, and therefore less cost.
Yes. So again, like for like, broadly no difference. The delta is mainly driven by lives.
Yes. All right. But I mean, like for like, broadly no difference. But his is slightly higher, even on a like for like basis, on the costs, and so his profit coming out of that would be slightly lower, would it? Because you use a higher head count, so a lower head count, and because therefore you use less office.
Yes, I think that's fair. Yeah.
So on rent, you would not say that Mr. Cottle has overestimated the rent that would be associated with this project. Underestimated, sorry. I do apologise. I'm normally clearer than this, and I do apologise.
Did you mind asking that question again?
Yeah. So given that Mr. Cottle's assumptions lead to a higher rental cost, even on a like-for-like basis, even if it's marginal, you would not accuse him of underestimating the rent for this project?
I wouldn't accuse him of underestimating the rent, no.
All right, now, can we please go to page 1399? If I can do this without confusing everybody in the courtroom. We're back to your summary of the profit that would have been, or could have been, to put it neutrally, earned. And so we've talked about the first line of that, the gross revenue, total gross revenue line. Now, we've also, if you look just below that, we've talked about the ASP fee. There's no real difference between you about costs of cards printing beyond the number of lives, is there?
No.
But there is a difference between you on the royalty fee.
In the sense that I deduct royalty fees and Mr. Cottle doesn't.
Yes, correct. And he's done a calculation of the royalty fees that he would accept if they were to be included. Have you seen that calculation?
Yes, I have, and I think I said in my first report that I checked them, and arithmetically they're correct.
But that would have been his first calculation. He's done another calculation, hasn't he, after he got the updated data from you?
Yes.
Have you seen those calculations?
Yes, I have.
Have you checked them?
Yes.
And they're correct, are they?
Yes, I didn't find any material differences.
Very good. So the issue between you is whether or not you bring into the profit the royalty fee.
Exactly.
And we might be able to just cut through this, because ultimately, isn't that just a question of law?
From my understanding of the arguments being put forward by Mr. Cottle, I think he's under the instruction that a legal perspective, the costs would effectively be remunerated as part of the reward. So, in that sense, I think he's stating that there isn't a loss. Sorry, a saving to GMGHS, the client, from approaching the subject strictly from an accounting perspective. The royalty fee is directly correlated to revenue on an 8% basis, on a net revenue. So that's administration fee income less rebates. And if that revenue isn't earned, as is alleged as part of this dispute, then that would necessitate, purely from GMGHS's profit and loss account, a resulting saving. But I do defer to the court on the legal argument.
Yeah, so the question is whether or not the claimant would actually save on this royalty fee, because it hasn't been paid the money under the contract on the assumption that something's due, as opposed to getting an award in damages. Is that a fair summary? That's
of the legal arguments?
Yeah, of the actual issue between the parties. Because if
what I understand.
Yeah, so if I put it like this, I mean, if the court was to make an award of damages of whatever it may be, let's take a sum, 10 million or a million, whatever you want it to be. If the result of that payment is that something, or of that award, was that something was then due in royalties, then the cost would never have been saved.
True. So, from my understanding of that, the award would then be effectively paying not losses in relation to GMGHS, but losses in relation to its contractual obligations onwards.
Well, no. I mean, the question from GMGHS's position is whether it's actually saving those royalties, isn't it?
Yes.
So if it's going to have to pay those royalties with a damages award, then it's not saving those royalties, is it? That's the question.
Underpinning that is the legal argument.
Underpinning that is the legal argument, exactly. That's what it comes down to, isn't it? It comes down to the question of whether, as a matter of law, a damages award would trigger a royalties payment under the franchising and licensing agreement.
Yes, absolutely. I have reviewed the FLA, and I think I stated in my report that I can't see anything that would pertain to onward payments of damages for royalties not earned. But again, that's outside my area of expertise. I'm just reviewing.
That is outside your area of expertise, isn't it? Because that's the construction of the franchising and licensing agreement, isn't it? Yes? That depends on what is meant by the words gross revenues in that document, doesn't it? What you've just said.
I'm not sure if I follow your question.
If the damages award amounts to, in reality, an award which reflects gross revenues, And that means, that therefore means that the claimant has received gross revenues. If that is a true construction of that document, then royalties will be payable as 8% of gross revenues.
I wouldn't be able to comment on the construction FLA agreement.
Well, you are. This is my point. You are commenting on the construction of the FLA agreement by giving evidence that you've been through the document. It doesn't say anything that would trigger it. That depends on the interpretation of the document, doesn't it?
Does depend on the interpretation of the document. And again, I'm looking at purely from a forensic accounting perspective and an accounting perspective. If there are onward legal implications whereby this money isn't effect saved, then I'd obviously defer to Your Excellency on that.
And I think one of the points you make is that if the parent company who is due these royalties is suffering some sort of loss, then that should play no part in the assessment of the actual loss by the claimant company.
In the sense that if we're just looking at the scope of the claimant in isolation,
Yes.
then yes.
So would you accept that when you calculate damages, you should ignore the financial consequences on the parent and focus solely on the company which has or hasn't suffered the loss?
I think it could, again, this is a legal argument that I think we're potentially stepping outside my area of expertise and scope. So I don't know if I can fully comment on that.
Very good. So similarly, when you look down at the bottom of this page, when you put in reference to what you describe as the claimant's share of the loss in dirhams, do you see that?
Yes.
What you have done is, in the box above, you've applied a 49% percentage by reference to the shareholding position of the claimant, haven't you?
Yes.
And in fairness to you, you can take no position whatsoever about whether or not that is a reasonable or that is an appropriate deduction to make.
I think the point that I was trying to make on this, and again, I think it is essentially a legal argument, is that the defendant is obviously, the claimant is obviously pursuing damages from as GMGHS, which, had the TPA agreement progressed, would have effectively morphed into a joint venture entity, which would be majority owned by the defendant. So what I was pointing out in terms of this issue is that it seems incongruous but potentially legally applicable that that a defendant would effectively have to pay out damages to an entity in which it receives the majority ownership. So effectively, it seems to me that it's potentially paying damages to an entity which would effectively feed back into itself.
You're not suggesting that there's any kind of element of cost to the claimant associated with those intended arrangements there? You can describe it as a cost.
Sorry, cost in relation to what?
49%. You're not suggesting that the 51% that you have deducted is a cost that the claimant would have incurred, are you?
No.
So it all comes down to whether or not it's not in fact in the TPA agreement at all, but it all comes down to the question of whether or not the share transfer that was anticipated in the memorandum of understanding, whether those terms of that agreement mean that as a matter of law, you make some sort of deduction. That's really, it's a legal issue, isn't it?
It's a legal issue, and I understand that, yes, it would necessitate the joint venture effectively being incorporated. But I understood that was necessary as part of the commencement of the arrangement.
There is an issue between you and Mr. Cottle on the question of revenue recognition. And you've heard, obviously, Mr. Cottle's evidence in relation to that. And the difference is, can I summarise it and see whether you agree with the summary? And then we'll go on and talk about the reasons why you disagree. So as I understand it, he calculates the interest from the date on which he anticipates cash would have been received under these arrangements. And you say some of that cash would have been received before it would be recognised as having accrued in the accounts. And so you take the date of accrual in the accounts as being the relevant date for the calculation of interest. Is that a fair summary of the difference?
Yes, I'd say that's a fair summary. Yeah. It's difficult to know how much of that cash would have been received. That's the difficulty. So I think some, but an unknown sum is a fair representation.
But you accept that the liability would have arisen to make the payments at the dates that Mr. Cottle has used to for these purposes.
The liability, again, that's possibly stepping on kind of a legal question, but
it's not though, it is. The debt would have arisen at the date Mr. Cottle says. The dates that
the
Mr.
debts
Cottle
to
GLOBEMED for the revenues that are coming in, the monies that are coming in, the fees, if they arose,
I think under the TPA there is a mechanism in which an estimation or a forecast of the administration fee income is effectively paid on the transfer of life or on the administration of life. Obviously, for that to be paid in advance, you need to estimate it for a number of factors. One is you don't know how big the portfolio of lives you're going to manage by the end of that year. And two, effectively the fee income earned on that life and the minimum and maximum cap can change. So there is an element of forecast and then there's a retrospective true up.
Yes.
And it would in terms of the talking liability or I prefer to use the timing of payments, that timing of payment would be based very much on an estimate or a projected value for that year.
Yes. And so Mr. Cottle goes on doing the best he can on the timing of payments, whereas you go on the accrual basis of when those payments have been earned according to the accounting standards.
Yes, so I think Mr. Cottle assumes that all would have been paid as effectively as soon as the transfer has happened. I think there is a slight disconnect between what would have been forecast and then paid as soon as the transfer happened, and then there are kind of retrospective true up. I go on the accruals basis, mainly because I think in terms of loss of profit calculations, and in terms of discounted cash flows, I would say when you're looking historically, when you're calculating losses, it is a very normal and common methodology by which to calculate loss of profits by using the accruals basis. And that's mainly because a lot of the information that we get in terms of calculating losses is also done in accordance with financial statements and IFRS, which again is on an accruals basis. And for this particular dispute, all the information that we have is effectively on the accruals basis. So the MOU is prepared on an accruals basis. The financial statements that we have for GMGHS, again, accruals basis. And we really don't have any, or I'd say potentially not any, but very limited cash information. And in order to calculate a cash loss, we would need, ideally, cash flow statements to do it properly and consistently.
So just starting at your start, your answer, this is not a discounted cash flow analysis, is it?
No, it's not. Discounted cash flow analysis tends to be for a projection of future losses, which you then discount back to the present day. Mr. Cottle, I think, discusses the discount cash flow basis in his first report, and I think suitably says it's not the correct way of calculating this loss, and I deal with it in my first report and agree with him.
So that is not a reason for treating the interest calculation, for making the interest calculation by reference to the accruals basis in this case, then?
Well, in terms of calculating, I think, loss of profits, I've used what I say is a very common approach for historical losses, and I feel that it is more consistent given the information that we have. So I would prefer to put forward a calculation that is consistent both on revenues and costs than try and make assumptions to draw the timing of losses potentially forward, as Mr. Cottle has done, or to the alternative. In terms of interest that's calculated, again, I defer to the court as to whether interest should be calculated based on loss of profits, as you would calculate as part of your financial statements, or if there is a necessity for the timing of that cash flow. But in relation to the timing of that cash flow, I think I have limited information, and Mr. Cottle likewise has limited information on the revenue side, in which he's making estimates both in terms of the administration fee income and rebates. There are some fairly broad assumptions which has the impact of bringing forward revenue, but the majority of costs are done on an accruals basis, which effectively leaves the cost towards the back end of the period. So in one sense, you've got revenue that's potentially brought forward to replicate a cash basis, and therefore incurring losses earlier, but that is not reflected in the costs also being brought forward, some of which would be incurred upfront on a cash basis.
As I'm asking you very short, narrow questions, and you're giving an extremely long speech. I asked you very distinctly.
Sometimes I think these complex points need clarification.
Wait for the question. Wait for the question. I asked you about this. You gave an answer which says, well, part of the reason why I've used an accruals basis is because it's appropriate in a discounted cash flow analysis. I then asked you two short questions. One is, this isn't a discounted cash flow analysis. Answer a very long answer, which had very little to do with
I think I agreed with you on that point.
And yes, but after a very long answer. And then the second point was, well, that factor cannot have been a factor in your decision to approach this on an accrual basis in this case, because you're not using that analysis in this case. Answer a very long series of other points about why you've approached it on the accrual basis. So can we just focus on the question? I've got very few questions left for you, but if we keep going like this, we will be here all day. So please listen to the question, answer the question. So the answer to the question is no, you're not using a discounted cash flow analysis in this case. And the answer to the question is, and therefore, the relevance or the fact that sometimes in a discounted cash flow analysis you use an accruals basis for calculating interest is neither here nor there in this case.
Sorry, I think that second question is used. Discounted cash flow.
You're not using a discounted cash flow analysis in this case.
Correct.
You explained, as I'd understood your first answer, that sometimes you'd use you use an accruals basis for the calculation of interest in a discounted cash flow analysis. That is not relevant in this case, then, is it?
No, I think either I've answered incorrectly or I've confused you. Apologies for that. In terms of calculating losses, discounted cash flow basis is utilised, but generally when you're looking at future losses.
Why are you talking about discounted cash flow analysis at all then in your answer, if you're not using it?
Because the reason why I was raising that, and I hope to put it across to Your Excellency, is that on occasion, a loss of profits on a cash basis is appropriate. Generally, for discounted cash flow purposes, looking at historic losses, calculating it on a loss of profit basis, using matching principles and in accordance with auditing standards is also equally appropriate, if not potentially more appropriate than the cash flow basis.
Can we take it back to first principles a little bit? Let's assume we know exactly when cash would have been received. So putting aside your concerns, as you express them, about the reliability of that information, we know exactly when cash would have been received. Once that cash is received, then the claimant is in a position to make use of it, aren't they?
Yes.
And so they are then they can put it in an interest-bearing account, for example, can't they? At that moment. And they can invest it.
Yes.
And that,
Subject to the costs going out, but yes.
yes. And that is right, regardless of when the accounts record it as having been accrued. Yes?
You can only invest cash if your cash flow in is exceeding your cash flow out. So presuming, if you're assuming that cash flow in is higher than cash flow out at that point in time, then yes, you can invest it. You can make use of it.
Yeah, but if you don't have any cash, if you're overdrawn, you can use the cash to pay off your overdraft and save interest, can't you?
Yes.
And again, your ability to use that cash is not affected by when the account's recorded as being accrued.
Yes, that's true.
All right. So if the intention of the calculation is to compensate a party for not being able to use money which it would have had in its hands, then the right date is the date of receipt, not the date of accrual. Would you accept that?
If we had perfect data.
You would. So the principle you accept, which is that with the right data, if you know when the money is in fact received, then you use the date of receipt to calculate the interest. Yes? So as to the... Right. So it is right, is it, therefore, that all of your concerns about the way in which Mr. Cottle calculates the interest ultimately come down to whether or not we can rely on his understanding of when money would have been paid and received?
I don't think I'll term it as rely on his understanding, but rely on the assumptions that he's adopted, but more pertinently, whether those assumptions are consistent.
You're concerned about the fact of when the cash comes in. You accepted that, yes? Or would have come in because we're dealing with a counterfactual, yes?
Yes.
And so the difference between you and him is in fact not the question of principle about whether we should use the receipt basis or the accrual basis. Your concern about his numbers is in fact about the reliability of his conclusions about when money would have been received.
Yes, and ensuring that the assumptions, again, are consistent both for revenue and costs.
And
It's a matter of consistency and complexity in light of the data that we have.
And you don't, though, in your report, do an analysis of the cash flow, do you? That you would have expected to see, and the timings of receipt of the cash.
I don't think I have enough information to be able to do that.
Bear with me just one moment. If the defendant had complied with the obligations set out in the TPA for dates of payments, would you accept that you get to Mr. Cottle's calculation on that assumption?
I think the terminology in the TPA is vague in the sense that it needs to be forecast. So there's a forecast and a true up, and it depends on the delta between the forecast and the true up.
But the forecast is about what is going to be paid, not when it has to be paid. Yes.
Yes, but what is going to be paid is inextricably linked with how many lives you're forecasting is going to be handled that year and or transferred.
Yeah, but doing the best. Sorry, go on.
So you need to make an assumption at the front end of the year to be able to apply the lives to the criteria of the administration fee income, and it's possible that forecast might be short, also possible it might be long, but I think going to your specific question, I cannot necessarily be sure that if the defendant carried out the clauses specified in the TPA, then it would result in the same administration fee income as Mr. Cottle. And that's besides the volume rebate points, which you might want to, which I can answer now, if it assists. But in terms of the volume rebate, that's a separate argument in terms of the timing of when cash could be received.
Right. So I think you said it depends on the amount of lives. It depends on the. So we just deal with administration revenue, traditional fee revenue for now, just as an example. So it depends on the amount of lives, but we've talked all around that. I mean, you agree with him on the amount of lives, subject to the resolution of those 3 points. Yes.
Yes.
And so you're right.
Well, and non-OIC lives as well.
Yes, so let's focus then on just the OIC. Thank you. And then presumably, you're right. I mean, there has to be a forecast and then a re-up. Now, the re-up will depend on the data, the actual number of lives. So there's no real room for discussion, debate about those numbers at the re-up stage, yes?
At the true-up stage, yeah.
The true-up stage. I do apologise. At the true-up stage. So at the true-up stage, we know from the data, assuming that portfolio had gone across, we know from the data what would have been payable and when in relation to the total that would have been paid by the end of the true-up, yes?
We'll know at the end of the year what the true-up would be.
Yes, and then the contract will tell us when that administration fees have to be paid, yes?
Sorry, there will be a difference between the beginning of the year forecast and the end of the year true up in terms of time.
Yes. So let's take it in stages then. So at the forecast at the beginning of the year, there's room for some judgment about what fees are now due. Yes? Yes?
Yes.
So your point is we can't be completely sure about what would have been payable at that stage. Is that your point?
That's my point, yeah.
But there's going to be a range, and you said it might have been short, it might have been long, but doing the best we can, if we look back, we can take a figure in the middle of that range, which will actually be the number of lives
that were involved, because we know that retrospectively, and get to a reasonable assumption, a reasonable conclusion about what would have been forecast at the beginning of each year, yes?
I suppose it depends on the nature of those forecasts between OIC and GMGHS.
You don't think that we can... are you saying it's not possible to go back and do a cash flow analysis of what we think is reasonably likely to have happened in terms of when the cash was flowing?
It's difficult, yeah, it's difficult.
Are you saying it's not possible to do that?
I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm saying it's very complex and difficult.
It's not really very complex, is it, though? I mean, we look at the lives that there were, we look at the lives from the previous year, and we say, well, what would they have thought would be the lives in the following year? It's not that complicated, is it?
In terms of... It's complicated in the sense that if the forecast is materially off, then you're falling into different brackets. So that it's possible that there could be a significant delta, and I wouldn't be surprised in the terms, for the sake of upfront payments, that the forecasts that are agreed to at the beginning of the year are fairly conservative.
Have you done that analysis yourself? Tried to go back and say, look, this is what I think would have been forecast at that year, given...
No, I haven't.
Bear with me one moment. Thank you very much, Mr. Burrows. Your Excellency, those are my questions. Thank you.
I've just got a few questions. Just been talking about the regime for the timing of fee payments. Where do we find that regime?
It's in the TPA agreement. But it's also, yes, the timing is specified in the TPA agreement.
We're shown an email exchange about the network, and whether it was included and whether it was to be paid for. Change in the part during the period of negotiation. In determining whether the network was within the bundle of assets and services provided by GMGHS to OIC, what would your primary source document be?
The FLA. And what I didn't have time to say earlier before questioning was cut off on the licensing fee is that there is a definition as to what the licensing or franchising fee, as it's also known as, pertains to. And I set that out in paragraph 6.08 to my first report.
The exchange in question was dealing not with licensing or franchising, but in fact with know-how and network.
Oh, apologies. Okay, so yes, 6.07. My report.
Yes, and where would you find the source information or the primary source document in respect of that?
So the primary source document that I had was the financial statements. So there was a reference to the established know-how being purchased in 2013 from the onshore entity, GLOBEMED Gulf. And then I think again there's reference in the TPA.
Reference in the TPA too. Sorry, could you just...
I'm just trying to recollect if there's any reference to the established network in the TPA.
You want to look at that document?
Yes, please. I imagine it's around appendix. Sorry, the FLA. Bear with me.
FLA is between GlobeMed Limited and GMGHS, isn't it?
It is, yes.
In seeking to identify whether the network was within the assets and services provided by GMGHS to OIC, what would be your primary source document?
It would be the TPA.
You were asked about a data set used to assess the volume rebate rate for 2019. Could you turn to page 1148? You see paragraph 50632, little Roman 2, reference in your report to a volume discount report. Shows the paid amount, volume discount amount split between BUPA and non-BUPA lives for the hospitals that provides volume rebates, which I summarise in CB31 and Exhibit C. The volume rebates is a reference to footnote 88 and a reference to C19 volume discount updated, and then an Excel spreadsheet. Could you tell us what that document was?
Yes, so that was a detailed document that was provided to me, specifying the split of claims value, claims paid, and also the rebates earned. And I was able to split that information between BUPA and non-BUPA hospitals.
Could you turn on to page 1202, 1202? List of documents reviewed in my report. Look at item 25 at the bottom of that table. What is that document?
Yeah, that document is the document that we just referred to in the earlier paragraph, and the source of my detailed rebate calculation at CB 32, I think.
Down onto page 1212, 1212. How does this document relate to C19?
Yeah, so this document is the volume rebates that are earned against alias group numbers. So effectively, the far left column is the rebates earned against different medical health service providers, but their names have been redacted, and it allows me to calculate effectively on a specific hospital by hospital basis what amounts were paid in terms of claims and what rebates were earned and effectively paid. And as part of this analysis, and I did set this out in my report, around 7% of the volume discounts actually that were sought remained unpaid.
Lastly, could you look at 1238, 1, 2, 3? How does that analysis relate to the document we've just been looking at?
So this is an amalgamation of all the data across the source documents that were referred to earlier, and this is the kind of the resultant accumulation of that analysis in my schedule CB31.
I think you referred to discussing this with an OIC employee. What were the issues that arose in your discussion?
The difficulties in relation to this this discussion was just trying to one, extrapolate the data. It was quite a timely and cumbersome exercise, I think, to pull all this information together. And as part of these discussions, I did try and just interrogate what the reasons were for any changes in data from previous submissions and iterances. And it was partly as a result of time passing that data changed as more claims were made and volume discounts were reconciled and ultimately paid. You know, even given the fact that this whole process was done in Q4 2022 or November 2022, a good number of years after the data set in which I received. So it does demonstrate the fact that it can take a long time to understand claims, to understand the extent claims are paid, and to understand at what point volume discounts are reconciled and resultingly received from a kind of cash perspective to an insurance company or a potential TPA.
No further questions.
I have no any further questions. Thank you. Up next.
Yeah. On the evidence.
Right.
So next steps, Your Excellency, we're in your hands. I think I had a very short word with my learned friend yesterday about this, as to whether we would sort of bowl straight into closings tomorrow. But we do think we probably are going to be able to give you more assistance to marshal the evidence a bit if we come back on Friday morning.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about as well.
The agreement, I think, in terms of the timetable was that we would start on Monday morning at 9 a.m. Friday morning. I'm sorry, I've been doing this all day and it's entirely my fault. Apologise to Mr. Burrows as well. We start on Friday morning at 9 a.m. We run till 12, which leaves the 2-hour. I think, Your Excellency, the court requires a 2-hour time break.
We might stand until 12:30 or even 1 p.m. if we like. Then we have a break from 1 to 2, then we'll continue after that.
I see. All right. So we can run from 9 till 1.
Yeah.
And then it's just important that I think for our purposes, we know what the total time allocation is that we're dealing with, and then we can make sure that we have a fair allocation between us, because I don't want to take up, the whole of the morning and then leave my learned friend with nothing. So if we assume 9 till 1 with a couple of breaks, I suspect, for interpreters, that leaves 4 hours before lunch with half an hour for interpreter breaks, say 3.5 hours before lunch, and then if we come back at 2 and run till 4, that leaves us another 2 hours.
We can stay until 5. If you like.
So that would be 3 plus 3.5. So if I do 3, you make a start before lunch. Oh yes, and we need interpreters breaks in the afternoon as well. So perhaps we'll put our heads together with the numbers and we'll agree a schedule.
The break is short break, 10 minutes.
Very good. Yes.
But I think in broad terms we agreed that it should be equal time for the parties.
Yeah, sure.
Yes, I think
Including the answer.
including the reply. Thank you. Yes, absolutely, and that's fair.
See how it goes, but I mean, I'm very flexible to stay until 5:30.
Thank you very much.
It's needed to be.
So that's very appreciated, and we'll try and make sure that we give you all the assistance you need.
Right, thank you very much. So we'll break now and come back on Friday.
Thank you.
9 a.m. Thank you.
Bye.